Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is Comprehensivist Wednesdays. This is done in conjunction with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society, and it is our week for neuroscience. We'll have our regular presenter, Sanjay, and tonight he'll be comparing biological brains and AI large language models. So just to set the expectations of everybody, how do you propose or wish to run this, Sanjay? Do you wish to do a presentation like you usually do, stop and then finish, and then we'll go to Q&A? We'll do Q&A in the middle and towards the end, and then we'll have a dialogue at the end and then move on. Does that work?
We'll keep a similar format. I'm going to have some slides, and although this is not going to be as much focused on slides, I think the discussion is there's really a lot of changes happening right now. So I'm going to present the slides more as talking points, and I'd like to have more of a discussion to try to get people to think exactly about what's happening in our brains, as well as we're using these AI systems as pointers, you might say, based on how they behave, to help us understand how biological brains may behave. So the slides are fewer. I have them, but I'm not going to focus on those as much today.
Oh, so with that, go ahead and get started.
All right, let me get started. Oh. Sorry, it went to the wrong. Okay, this should work now. Okay, so we should see opening screen. Is that visible?
It is. It
okay.
is working.
Very good.
Usually I know you do have some issues with the slides, but it doesn't appear to be cutting off anywhere.
Okay. So let me start. So basically, what we're going to do is first I want to go into information. So the talk tonight is going to be focused. Let me step us back. So the talk tonight is going to be looking at current modern artificial intelligence systems, and there actually have been some pretty significant developments recently in the last month or so, and they're actually ongoing even now, and they're going to continue for the rest of the year. And these are pretty significant developments, and they're starting to give us a lot more insight into. I mean, they have given us a lot more insight into what are happening in these artificial networks, but the phenomenon and the behavior and the phenomenology that we're seeing are actually matching a lot of what human behavior is like. So that gives us a way for analogizing, for comparing the two systems, the biological systems with the artificial systems. So what we're going to do tonight is really look at a lot of these systems, and I'm going to introduce some ideas and possible suggestions, because we obviously don't know exactly what's happening within the brain, although the indications we have, and there are several theories, some of which are pretty strong. The evidence is strong for them, and a lot of the research has not found any flaws or problems with them. So they are the dominant theories, and I'll talk about those more because the AI systems seem to be enforcing or reinforcing the ideas that we have about those parts of the brain. So let's jump into it. So the first thing to talk about really is the type of information that our brains process, and I'm starting with this because most people may not be aware of this, but one of the developments that happened recently is that these artificial systems, typically when we think of the modern AI, a lot of people think of these chatbots, and chatbots basically deal with text. You type in some information, and it gives you information back as text. And so they are basically what are known as unimodal, or they're dealing with a single type of information, textual information only, typewritten information only, not even speech. not even verbal information. So the development that's happened is that there is a significant new system that's been developed that's available now, which actually uses more than only text. It uses actually multiple types of modalities. And there's another system that it's actually just days to weeks away from being released. There's a lot of talk behind the scenes of it, and it's actually basically finished, but they're trying to do some prep work before it's brought out to the public. And then there's a third system which is going to be brought out in a few months. So the first system that I described is known as GPT-4. There are actually two variants of it. People may not realize, but there's two variants of it. And what the company OpenAI has done is they actually have a single site that you go to, which is called ChatGPT Plus. And behind the scenes, it goes to the latest iteration, or depending on what kind of subscription you have, it goes to either ChatGPT-3, it goes to GPT-3 or GPT-4 or GPT-4V, which is the latest iteration, depending on the type of account you have with them. But the latest iteration is GPT-4, which is more advanced than anything else we've seen. So, and which is a multimodal system. So the word multimodal, we're going to describe that briefly. But basically, multimodal means that information that we process, that humans process, and many animals process, come in multiple forms. So we know about LLMs, the traditional AI systems that process only text, but these newer systems process also images, and some of them process audio, and the ones to come soon are also processing video. So the multimodal nature of information is what's important, and that actually helps us to understand, because our brains, as we know, inherently is multimodal from birth. But these systems, we're developing them, step by step, from the simplest systems and adding features into them. So the current systems, the previous systems that we had, were not multimodal. They're primarily textual in nature. And the newer systems are starting to be multimodal, and the systems we'll have in a few weeks, definitely by the end of the year, will be significantly multimodal, to have multiple, probably all four of these modalities. So the first thing to look at is that systems that are multimodal, there's actually different types of, so we have textual information, we have image information, we can have audio information, we can have video information. These are typically types of information that we process. Now, animals and human beings, we process more than these types of information. For example, there's a spatial temporal information. There's information about our skin and body. So visceral information about, for example, if we're hungry or our stomach growls or things like that. We have information about balance, whether our body is balancing or not. Proprioceptive information about where our limbs, even if we close our eyes, we can sense the position of our limbs. We don't have to actually look at our limbs to know that. So there's many other types of information that our brains can process, but and those probably will be developed into these systems later as they gain robotic abilities. And tonight we're not going to talk about robotics, but that's a whole different side of AI, which actually some of these systems have. One of the systems that is in the works right now actually has very powerful robotic systems. We're not going to talk about those, and that actually comes into play also for prostheses, because for humans, who've lost limbs, it's a very important element, because they in not too distant future, we actually will have systems which will be able to give significantly better prosthetic abilities. For example, for sensing, there's actually some systems that exist today that have been in the research phase for a very small number of patients, less than 10 patients around the world. But they've been implanted with prostheses that actually can help them sense when they pick up something, an object, that they can actually sense the pressure of it, and they can manipulate, so they have much better dexterity. So anyway, multimodal refers to multiple types of information that a system that are neural based system can process. So textual information, image, audio, and video are four types that we're going to talk about tonight. And if we look at these, we can actually split these into three different subcategories. So you can have static information in all of these types. You can have temporal information, which basically means time variant, changing over time. And then you can have a mathematical representation of all of these. I shouldn't say representation, a mathematical encoding of this information, which is different from mathematical representation. So just to give an example, for text, the static type of text information is a natural form. Written information that we see is called text. The temporal information, so for example, on the bottom of a TV set or a video screen, let's say, you'll have text that scrolls past, and that changes over time automatically. And that's an example of a temporal text which changes by itself over time. A mathematical example of text is Roman numerals. Roman numerals are basically numbers. As those of us who learned it, it's basically the letters, the alphabetic letters, C, X, I, V. These letters, the normal letters, but they have an added layer of significance to them, which allows us to treat them as numbers. And actually, in other cultures also, they use this also in Indian culture before the Indian Arabic number system came about. They actually used Indian letters in exactly the same way that the Roman numerals exist. Also, we can use tables. Tables are a form of using text to encode mathematical information. For example, you can have a table of, it doesn't even actually have to have numbers in the table. You can have a table with images, you can have a table with words. And that table can encode, for example, the frequency of something, how often something occurs. So that's an example of mathematical information using text. The next type of information is images. So images, photos are the static form of images. A photograph, and it can be an artificial photograph, or it can be a real photograph taken using cameras, whatever type. Kaleidoscopes, or some types of animation, you can think of them as a temporal image, an image which changes over time. But I mean, another way of looking at that is really what video is. Video is an image that changes over time. But you can have an image which the content of the image doesn't really change, but let's say the colors in the image changes. So I chose an example of a kaleidoscope. That's something where the actual image doesn't really change, but the color encoding of different parts of the image might change. So something changes, not significantly, but something changes in the image. And the mathematical representation or mathematics that can be encoded using image form are graphs, so a bar chart, a line graph, a pie chart. These are basically images. They're a two-dimensional static image, but they encode information that's mathematical in nature. So all these types of information exist. So audio also exists in many forms. So in terms of a static audio, we don't think of audio as static, but if you think of a constant tone, right, a monotone, that's basically what a static audio is. It's a single frequency that effectively repeats over time. So audio by nature encodes time, or we think of audio as having a time element. But if we think of a single tone, a single key on a piano, or a single key on a musical instrument, that doesn't have to have time associated with it, because when you see it written in written form, a musical notation, there's no time necessarily. A single a B flat doesn't have a time associated with it. You can have additional notation added onto it, which tells you how long that tone should be played, or the speed at which the tone plays, and then you shift to the next tone, to the next key. That's information that's additional to the static type of audio. The most common type of audio that we're familiar with is music and speech, and these definitely have a time component to them. They only exist as time passes. So you need time to flow to actually understand and process and interpret music and speech. And the mathematical type of information that audio has is represented as a spectrogram, and it can be a two-dimensional or three-dimensional spectrogram. And the simplest way that you can have is on audio equipment. Sometimes they'll show a bar graph, which shows the different frequency and the volume at different, the amplitude at different frequencies. That's a simple type of spectrogram. The more sophisticated ones, that basically is a mathematical encoding of the audio information that's playing, and that spectrogram changes over time, just as audio changes over time. So it keeps up with the mathematical representation of the audio. The bar graph, with the spectrogram is, it changes and gives us the information that the audio has in real time. So that's an example. And video, again, has the same thing. So in video, you can freeze the frame, you can pause a video. And so a freeze frame is a static representation of a video. The temporal, the normal form that we see videos are, as videos and films. You can have, the real world to us is really a temporal form of video. Okay, everything that happens around us that we see through our eyes is in fact video. So our brain is naturally intuitively accustomed to processing video. That's one of the most important types of information that we grasp. And because video is constant for us, that it's always available to us instantly, we really don't even think of it as having a time component. But if you think about it, video has to have a time component in it. So that's an important element there. And again, mathematically, you can have encoding using what are known as 4D spectrograms, which are a little more complicated, but effectively they're like 2D and 3D spectrograms, except they include the time component because video has time. So these are important elements to understand about information. So the next slide, okay. So there's a mistake, I think. So characteristics of information that our brain or any kind of processing system can process. So characteristics of information. So information can be represented in many different ways. That's important to understand. So the previous slide showed us that information, the same type of information, for example, letters. Letters can encode not only text and they can also encode sounds. So the letters have sounds associated with them. Letters can also be used to represent numbers as Roman numerals, and they can be used to represent mathematical concepts. For example, the Greek letter theta, which is a letter. That letter theta is used to represent what's known as an angle in geometry. So information, the same thing, the same letter or the same information, same text can be used to represent different types of information. What that means is that any processing system must be able to convert information from one type to another type, from one mode to another mode. So audio can be represented both as images, and so we should be able to convert it, or we should be able to understand, interpret what a spectrogram of an audio is versus the sound that we hear from our ears. So we should be able to kind of interpret audio using both ways, and many people can now. A spectrogram is not something that's very common, so a lot of people can't, but people who are accustomed to seeing spectrograms, for example, people working in the audio industry or the broadcast industry, they understand spectrograms, not understand, but they can get information out of a spectrogram more than the average person can, because they're familiar with it and they understand the types of information that's encoded in them. Another type of conversion that's common is speech. So speech again is audio. So speech can be transcribed into text through text-only representation. Although there's an important, the second bullet gives us another piece of information which is very important about information, is that some encodings of information actually have more information, more raw information than other forms. So for example, speech, the audio form of speech, has much more information than the text-only representation of that speech. For example, the text-only representation is missing things like gaps in speech or intonation, tone, the voice quality of the person. My voice is starting to crack. Sorry about that. I've been on video calls most of the day. So the speech form of information carries much more for us than a text-only representation. Speech can also carry emotions, which text doesn't. That's the reason why we created these things called emojis and emoticons. So speech and text are different variants of similar information. An image can be represented as a vector in a vector space. And again, this is internal to mathematics. I'm not going to go too much into this. But basically that's what an image is. And if you, another way to look at an image is when we see an image, and animals to some extent, when complex animals see an image, they can recognize specific objects in the image. So when we see an image in front of us, we can recognize that there's a chair over there, that our pet is over there, and that feature is a wall, and that feature is a ceiling. And we can recognize different elements in that image. And so represented by a vector, that phrase really means that the encoding of components or sub-information within an image can be put into vector form. That's all that means. And vector space is a very rich and complex way of encoding information, which computers do all the time. And in some sense, our brain actually does too, because vector is not necessarily a mathematical concept, although it is a mathematical term. But you can think of a vector as simply a table. Okay, the simplest way to think of a vector is a table that it might have 2-3 rows. So a three-dimensional vector you can think of it as having 3 rows. A two-dimensional vector can have 2 rows. Our brain, a lot of the information that our brain handles, also is in vector form. So it's not that computers and brains do things in different ways. So that's one of the things that we're going to go into tonight, is that there's actually a lot of similarity that we've learned about how information is kept and processed in our brain. So a video, the fourth bullet here, a video is again a sequence of images, so static images shifting over time. So I think most people know that, in the olden days when we had films on celluloid film, that you literally could see a frame, and that frame literally moved in front of the lens, and the next frame came into focus, and it stayed for a few milliseconds, and then it moved again, and the next frame stayed for a few milliseconds. The frames kept moving up and up and up, and the timing of those frames shifting over was rapid enough, and it was designed in a way that worked with our visual system, with animal visual systems, to give us a sensation of moving images. But in the raw nature of a video is that they basically are they're static images, and some videos also have audio with them. So those are examples where video, the most complex form of videos have moving images plus complex audio, and audio and videos can actually be monophonic, so a single audio track. You can have stereophonic, which is extremely common, or now a lot of videos, especially film, have multiple tracks. So people have heard of Dolby surround sound audio in movies, and so there are many types of surround sound. You used to have basically five channels of surround sound. Now they have 7 and 9 and even more. Go into the more sophisticated theaters. So even the sub information within these categories have multiple layers. So an image, you can have a video which has images of a low resolution, or you can have images of a very high resolution. So for example, you can have a video which is 4K, what's known as 4K, which is very high resolution. And you can have audio, which is low fidelity or high fidelity, or single channel or multi-channel. So even within the concept of video, you have multiple layers of sub-categorization of the subtypes of information that video encodes, which is in images and audio. And text. Text can be represented as an image if you take a picture of it, or if you take a photograph and you write on it, right? So text can become a part of an image, or you can have an image created which only contains text, or it contains text and visual information. So you can combine types of information here. And a data table can be converted into a chart, which basically is an image, as we talked about earlier. So converting information from one form to another is something that we intuitively do, but these AI systems have not been able to do yet. And now the newest systems are extremely sophisticated in the ability to do almost all of these types of conversions. And that's one of the changes that's happened in the last few months, but especially in the last month, that have given us a lot more insight into what's happening with these systems. So we're going to do a little more comparison between biological networks and artificial intelligent networks. So the basic, this slide is going to go into some of the basics. So audio can be represented. Oh, wait a minute, why is this? Okay, that line shouldn't be. Anyway, so a network is just a circuit of neurons. Sorry about that. That second line shouldn't be there. All neural networks, whether they're biological or artificial, consist of a network. which is another way of saying a circuit, an interconnected circuit of neurons. And those of you who've been attending here, most of you, I think, should understand what a neuron is. If you don't, you can definitely raise your hand or ask when we take a break in a few minutes. But a neuron is the smallest unit of processing that any information processing system, parallel information processing system, for example, biological brains or neural networks, it's the smallest unit of processing that they have. And they always consist of many of these neurons interconnected into a network. And when I say many, the artificial intelligence, the artificial networks now have on the order of a small number of billions, 1 to 2 billion neurons, equivalent of neurons. And again, these neurons are very simple. They're not the equivalent of biological neurons. So even comparing them in the same sense is actually not accurate. So in these two fields, we actually use the term neuronal versus neuron. Neuronal is used for biological neurons, although the term neuron is used interchangeably for both. But when you hear the term neuronal, or if I use the term neuronal, it's referring specifically to biological neurons. So all of these systems are a network of neurons. That's very important to understand. Their behavior is, so this slide is talking about both biological and artificial systems. So all of their behavior is explainable using complex mathematics, okay, using set theory, graph theory, using network theory, which is a subset of graph theory, using linear differential equations. So there's different, and there are different types of representations that each of these different mathematical sub areas provide, and all of them, even actually, I'm not going to go to the mathematics. So there's many types of mathematics which very, very precisely explain the nature of networks. And what we've seen so far is that the explanation, the mathematical explanation that we get out of the mathematics apply equally well to these artificial networks as they do to biological networks. At the base level, biological brains and artificial networks, follow basically the same mathematical patterns and mathematical rules and mathematical systems. Effectively, they're the same thing. Now, so at the micro level, at the lowest level, both can be explained using the same mathematical laws and rules. So the biological neurons, biological neurons are much more complex, and biological networks, meaning tissue, for example, the brain, have many more processes, features, complexity. They're actually much more complicated than these simple neurons in artificial intelligence. But that complexity doesn't affect the mathematics at the level we're talking about here. Now, those complex behaviors of biological neurons have their own set of more complex mathematics that we have to explain them. But those additional levels of mathematics are not needed to explain the gross level behaviors that we're seeing right now in these artificial intelligence systems and in animals and humans. So the types of behavior we see in animals and humans, for example, our ability to talk and interpret and understand and process various types of information, the slides that we looked at earlier. So various types of information, our ability to convert from one type of information to another, is the same across all of these types of systems, biological or artificial, because the mathematics is the same. But the level of complexity involved in our networks, because we have more complex neurons, has additional layers of mathematics which we can use to understand it better. But because the neurons in artificial networks are simplistic by nature, we don't need to use that higher level of mathematics. The simple level of mathematics or the general level of mathematics is efficient because they're mimicking the most important aspects of biological neurons, and they're providing that capability. So in a sense, it seems that that initial layer of mathematics, mathematical complexity, that is common to artificial and biological systems is sufficient to give us most of the features that we see today in artificial systems. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't know if there are additional features, for example, consciousness or higher order consciousness. We don't know if those need to be explained, or those arise from the more complex elements of our biological neurons or not. There are some theories that say they're not. Other theories say they are. So we don't know yet in those areas. But the more simpler types of behaviors that we're dealing with, and actually these behaviors are not simple. These behaviors are getting into probably most of the behaviors that the average human being engages in. Almost all behaviors that we see people and animals engaging in today have been able to be mimicked using just these very simple neurons and the level of mathematics that we have that explain that with biological. So for all practical purposes, the additional layer of complexity that exists in biological systems, it may not even be necessary. We're not sure yet, but it seems that it may not be necessary. And the state of neurons that we have right now, the type of neurons that we have, not the size of the networks, not the size of these artificial intelligence systems, that's a different thing. But the way that they're built today might be sufficient to give us almost all of the capabilities that animals and humans have. And I'm saying almost as a conservative statement, but some people believe, and I do agree with that statement, that it probably is, I believe it's likely that it's enough to explain everything that humans and biological systems are able to do. So anyway, but again, that last part is not understood, and it's still under conjecture. So just so I'm not sure anyway, I'm not going to. There's some minor issues with the slide that I have tonight, but we won't worry about it too much. The information seems to be fine. So another type of information that's important for us to understand is that the brain was shaped through evolution using genetics and epigenetics. And epigenetics is an aspect of genetics which is slightly different. It's the I'm trying to think of the right word, how to explain it. So in genetics, what happens is that genetics is an encoding in DNA and RNA. Genetics is an encoding of information, biological information, and proteins and synthesis and processes that need to occur within any organism. Genetics encodes that information. And a living thing, what it has to do is it has to decipher, it has to unencode, or it has to decode the information from its DNA. And one of the ways, this is why RNA is so important, because RNA and proteins are the mechanism that information is decoded from our genetics. So that decoding happens at two different stages. Genetics is the decoding that happens when an organism literally grows, when our cells divide and our cells are processing. And epigenetics is a decoding that happens in real time, second by second, millisecond by millisecond. So epigenetics is the decoding of genetic information in real time. So epigenetics can be affected by the state that we're in. So for example, if we live in a very cold climate, and we live our entire life in a very cold climate, the decoding that epigenetics provides will introduce slight changes into our genetics that make us more adaptable to that cold climate. This is the reason why we adapt. One of the reasons why our genomes adapt over time, because epigenetics is one of the mechanisms there, and this is a simplified version, but that's one of the mechanisms. So anyway, so we have been, biological systems have been shaped by genetics and epigenetics, which means that we are more or less hardwired in a lot of our intrinsic behaviors, not our learned behaviors. But when we're born, there are a lot of behaviors that we come hardwired with, but our behaviors are flexible. We can change a lot of our behaviors, and then flexibility is to some extent, there are ranges, there are predispositions that we have. So there's a set point that we're all born with, and then there are ranges that we can shift within. And some people have very wide ranges, some people have very narrow ranges. And these ranges are around our behaviors, but also around our biology. So for example, diseases are one of the reasons why some people are prone to certain diseases and other people are not, because of the predispositions. And the same token, our behavior can be prone the hardwiring of our behavior comes from our genetics, but it can be modified by learning and our own internal processes, what we call plasticity. And so the shaping of our brain also means that we have hardwired in us specific brain regions and subregions. We have, and the cortex is one region that is, if you look at it under a microscope, many regions of the cortex will be difficult to distinguish unless you're an expert. And even then, some regions cannot be distinguished throughout the cortex. If you look at the cerebellum, that's very distinct from the cortex. It's a very different types of region. So in terms of the specific tasks and the morphology or the physical structure of the different regions of the brain, they are different. They evolve differently, and they're encoded in our genetics to be different. So that's why when a new animal or baby is born, the cerebellum always forms in that specific way, and the types of neurons that the cerebellum have are quite distinct and different, and the shape of the cerebellum is in a specific location toward the back of the brain, attached to the brainstem, whereas the cortex is in a very different location. The cortex has different types of neurons. So all of these things are shaped by our genetics and our evolution. We have task-specific regions in our brain, and the structure and the form and the types of behaviors that they do are unique. We have hundreds of different unique regions of our brain working in parallel to create our complex behavior. And we have interconnections between the regions, and these interconnections also are hardwired. In a sense, our DNA encodes where we have these large tracts of axons, fibers. For example, the corpus callosum between the left and right hemisphere is an example of one of these of a massive network of interconnections that exist in pretty much every healthy brain, and these are very important elements to how biological neural networks work. Again, evolved through evolution. What that means is that we have evolved to be very energy efficient for survival. So our brain does a lot of things using energy efficient mechanisms. What that means is that our brain actually has limitations built into it. So our brain will stop doing certain types of processing if, for survival reasons and the encoding that evolution has provided in us, if we arrive at an answer that's sufficient enough, and depending on the context of the situation, whether you're talking about, if I'm looking at the scene in front of me, I won't spend too much time. I mean, the information comes into my brain, and almost instantly, within a few milliseconds, the information is available to my brain for processing. And it might take about half a second to a second for that information to flow through my brain, but within half a second, I will have a pretty robust understanding of the scene around me, assuming that I've been conscious for the last few minutes. Okay, if I have not been conscious for the last few minutes, meaning if I just woke up from sleep, or if I was, let's say, sedated for surgery, and I'm kind of groggy and coming out of the effects of the anesthesia, and I'm kind of waking up, and I open my eyes and I see something. Well, the same processes will happen. My brain will pick up on the signals, and within about half a second, the rest of my brain will have access to that information. But my brain won't understand it the way it will understand it if I had been awake for half an hour or hours beforehand. So depending on the context and the state of my brain, my brain will be able to do different types of things. And one example of this is the energy efficiency. So when my brain was unconscious under sedation, let's say under anesthesia for surgery, my brain was intentionally kept in a low metabolic state. It was not doing a lot of processing. It was saving energy. But what that means is that because it was saving energy, it was not collecting information about the outside world. It was basically ignoring where I was. It was ignoring what was happening. So when the surgery was over and I went to post-op and I started to wake up, my brain is kind of blank in many ways. It really doesn't know where I am. And so initially, that's the reason why it takes longer for our brain to kind of get a sense of where we are after we wake up. Longer than it does if you close your eyes and you open your eyes instantly. You kind of know because you haven't shifted much from where you were a minute ago. So this energy efficiency aspect is rooted in our brain in every way we can imagine. But what that means is that our brain has a lot of limitations built into it because of that. Another aspect is that, again, driven through evolution, but also driven because we are biological beings. So biological entities have a lot of these other limitations, which is that our neuronal activity have metabolites, which are, you might say, other molecules, which are, through metabolism, every cell, including neurons, metabolize energy. And so there are other molecules that are generated as part of neuronal activity. Some of those metabolites are neurotransmitters and other things. So, and as well as waste products. So these are aspects of biological tissue, or biological circuits, which exist, which cause inefficiencies and cause problems in our brain. And another third example, and there are many, many examples. I'm just giving a few examples here. Third example is that we need sleep. Some obvious reasons that we know about is that we need to recharge the mind and recharge the body. Recharge in the sense of energy, but also recharge in the sense of our awareness of what's happening and where we are. Also for waste removal, again, the waste that we talked about in the prior bullet, and for repair processes and memory consolidation. These are theories, but a repair process is another theory that's understood to some extent. But there are many, many reasons why we sleep, but our biological tissues, especially our cortical tissues, need sleep. It's essential. We'll die without it. So these are all elements of biological brains. Artificial brains, again, these are designed and they're shaped by people, engineers generally, and they've been designed to mimic the artificial brains. Now, a difference is that they are not as much hardwired as biological brains are. A artificial neural network is entirely flexible, and I'm going to put a caveat here, because the way that artificial intelligence, artificial systems exist isn't only in one way. They exist in many different forms. So what I'm describing here is that after a system has been completely developed and it's been put into, you might say, production use, it's been put into the world for people to use, that's the type of system that I'm talking about. But there are other types of artificial intelligence systems which are in the research phase, where they're being developed or they're being modified. They're still in a modifiable state. They haven't been frozen, for public use. So depending on the type of system, they are entirely flexible or they're not entirely flexible. So the ones that have been put out into the world for public use, they're not flexible anymore. They're kind of hard-coded and fixed, and they don't learn. Those systems do not learn. This is something a lot of people don't realize, that when you're typing into these chatbots, they are not learning anything from you. They won't remember unless, the more modern ones have been designed to kind of remember the past few paragraphs or sentences that you've given it. But if you close that window and reopen another window, that chatbot will not remember. Even though you tell it that you're the same person, it won't know who you are. It won't remember anything of the past any interaction it had with you or anyone else. That's important to understand. So the flexibility here is in terms of their design, and as well as when they're being trained, they're completely flexible, much more than biological systems. Now, these newer systems are starting to be task specific, and they're starting to have structural modules which are distinct, similar to the human brain. And again, this is being done intentionally, I think, because we have this aspect to biological brains. And initially, a lot of the researchers didn't understand that was important. You have to remember that the initial areas of artificial intelligence research, they didn't know which parts of biological brains were important, which were not important. So they started with the simplest model that they could. And the simplest model was just a bunch of neurons connected together. And those models didn't do much. And then they added more neurons into them. And this was the 1980s and 70s and 90s. And they added more neurons, and they went to thousands of neurons, and they still didn't get much out of them. And then they went to millions of neurons, and they still didn't get much out of them. And then what they did in the late 90s and early 2000s, they started giving them massive amounts of data, which is another element which was important. And that helped to add a lot of capability. So anyway, I'm not going to go into detail with that area, but the models that computer science have developed for AI have changed drastically over time. And those initial models didn't have different types of neurons that we in our brains have. The newer systems that they're developing now still don't have different types of neurons, but they have different types of structures of neurons, meaning the interconnections between neurons, the morphology of neurons, they are different in these newer systems because they've learned that helps. So these newer systems are, in a sense, starting to become more like, physically more like brains. And because of that, the resulting behavior that we see are also much more broad and sophisticated as full human beings are. Today, these systems have very few regions. In the other slide, I mentioned that in human brains we have hundreds. I think the number is like more than 150 distinct regions. A few years ago, 2 years ago, there was a really amazing study that characterized using very sophisticated methods. So anyway, so the artificial systems right now are in no way as complex as human brains, but even with the few regions that they're adding in, they're able to do a lot of the sophisticated processing and work that we humans can do. And again, these regions work in parallel. The training data and complexity are important aspects. I started to go into that. I don't want to go too far into that, but these are all vital elements to having these neural networks work. It's not just the network itself in biological systems, but also the training. And something a lot of people don't realize that for biological systems, we actually go through training too. It's called life. When we live the first year of life, for the first 6 months, the first, through our teen years and adulthood and etc., the years and years of living that we go through are all aspects of training that our brain gets and our body, combined gets. And all of that training happens naturally in real time for us. So it takes a long time, but that training can be condensed for these artificial systems into very, very short periods of time. Today, these most sophisticated systems are trained for months on end, which is still, compared to other computer systems, that's a lot of time. But that's because the amount of data is so immense. Because, as you can imagine, the amount of information that a single adult human has, it's a vast amount of information. So encoding all that information and processing it and kind of feeding it into these systems in a sophisticated, managed way takes months and months. 8 to 10 months right now, but that number may increase. But anyway, so these are important elements for neuronal systems. For neural systems. Again, because they're designed through mathematics, the shared mathematics. So what that means is that these systems do not need to be energy efficient. These current AI systems use massive amounts of energy, very wasteful in many senses, because they weren't designed with evolutionary efficiency in mind. Over time, we may build those factors into them and make them more efficient. But right now, these systems are extremely wasteful of energy. The neural processing, the processing that each neuron does, and in effect the entire network does, is it is theoretically ideal, because inside the computer, the processing that a single neuron does is at such a high precision and accuracy that it's theoretically ideal. Now, they're not infinitely ideal in the sense, because computers are not analog; these are digital computers, so they can't be. But in terms of the complement to biological systems, biological networks, they don't have any waste, they don't have any heat, they don't have any stress, they don't have any inefficiencies built into them, they don't have any damage, which in biological systems over time do happen. So none of these kind of problem type of situations exist in these artificial systems. So in that sense, they're actually much more efficient and they're much more robust. So that may explain why, even though they have fewer neurons and the neurons are simpler, that may be one of the reasons why these systems have so closely been able to match capabilities that humans have, even though our brains are more complex and larger, and in terms of the number of neurons, they're actually larger too. So even given that, these may be some of the reasons why these systems can be just as efficient, or almost as efficient as, or almost as capable as biological brains. And they have no need to sleep, so they can run forever, theoretically, as long as you give them enough energy. So last two aspects that I'm going to go into for brains, and I'm going to take a break, is that the brain, and this is just one area. There's many areas I could go into, but I wanted to limit it because I need to limit the talk to a reasonable amount of time. So an aspect I'm going to go into just very lightly tonight, and I'm going to try to expand on a lot of these topics in future talks. So this idea of consciousness And again, I've talked about it in prior discussions where consciousness is a single word that we use, but it's actually a misnomer because consciousness is not a single idea. It's not a single thing. In biological systems, consciousness exists at multiple levels, and there are many types of consciousness. And we've talked about this, many times. So hopefully everyone understands what I mean by that. In biological brains, and whether we're talking about the lowest level of consciousness or the highest level of consciousness, the lowest levels exist in animals, the highest level exists we see or we can detect only in humans, and to some extent, in the higher order primates. So whatever type of consciousness or awareness that you want to, call it, is naturally derived and exists in all these biological systems. It's not fully understood, but exists at many levels and many forms. The complement in biological systems the complement in artificial systems is that awareness and focus, they don't have consciousness, but the early systems from last year and prior really didn't have. Let me step back. So the systems from 2021 and prior had no focus and no awareness, and those systems were, so if you've been following this area over the last 3 or 4 years, you probably understand that the capability and behavior and complexity of these systems have leapfrogged every year pretty much. And now they're leapfrogging about every 6 months. Again, Moore's law is kind of rearing its head again. So prior to 2021, these systems didn't have any focus or awareness at all. In 2021, there was an important paper which had to do with this concept of awareness, which was introduced into the earlier systems. And so in 2021, we started to see the systems which today we call chatbots, which are LLMs. And these LLM systems had a very early rudimentary form of awareness added into them. But that awareness is still nothing like consciousness that humans or animals have. And then these newer systems that we have, the latter half of this year, actually the first system was developed in March of this year, and then it was upgraded again a few months ago. And recently there was another upgrade to it this past month, September. And that system, and again, there are other competing systems which will be coming out in a few weeks, and by the end of this year, we'll have probably 3 systems like this, which have added to them also awareness and focus in more sophisticated ways that we have. Again, not consciousness, not in any sense consciousness, but these systems now are starting to understand, it's starting to have a sense of the present. Okay. And I'm not going to go into what that means. We can talk about it in the discussion if you want, but these systems are starting to have that. Now, what I want to have a caveat is that this awareness and focus is not built into the system. It's an added on feature, which is kind of artificially forced. These systems intrinsically don't have, well, the awareness part they intrinsically have, but the focus and you might say, like when we think of consciousness, a person who's conscious, we think of that person having a fundamental awareness of what's happening in the moment, at that moment in time. And for these systems, that level doesn't exist at all. But that level is forced artificially through another layer, which is not a part of the AI. It's an added-on layer, which I'll describe verbally, but in future talks I'll expand on that a little more. So this awareness and focus is forced in artificially. They don't exist intrinsically in the network today. Example, the second bullet gets into how these are added in artificially. So if you use these chatbots, you would be aware that what we're basically doing is we're typing in information textually. So most of these systems still are text-based, but you can actually put in, you can paste in an image, and the future systems, upcoming systems, you can paste in a video, or you can give it a link to a video, and it'll find the video and effectively watch the video almost instantly. Or you can give it an audio file, or you can speak to it, vocalize speech to it. So the newer systems won't be limited to text only, but so far people, most of you will be familiar only with systems that rely on text. So what happens in these systems is that as we're typing in information for the system, we may be asking it to do something for us. Tell me the circumference of the Earth. Okay. and you type this in, what is the Earth's circumference, and you hit enter, and the system takes less than half a second, and it prompts out the answer, whatever it is. I don't remember, but I think 28,000. Anyway, I'm guessing that number comes to mind. So anyway, the system will churn out an answer. But in fact, what these modern systems, the ones from the last, I'm going to say 18 months, actually less, about 15 months, the modern systems, what they have is they have a hidden layer. It's not part of the neural network. It's add-on that's additional to the neural network. And that add-on is the part where we're typing. There are actually hidden information that the system adds in along with what we type. So when I type in this prompt, or when I type in this question, what's the circumference of the Earth? What these designers have done is they've added in a lot of other information that automatically, secretly, hidden, gets added into the one sentence that I've added in. And the type of information that gets added in is, for example, things like, and basically what they've done is that they add in the equivalent of, as if so if I want, I could simulate the exact same thing. So if I want to, I can type in all the same information that's being added in artificially, right? So I'm going to give you examples of what the types of information that they add in artificially, but these are saved into the system, not in the neural network, in a different part of the system. So some of the things that they add in are, they might say that respond to the user in the same language that they spoke in, okay? Now, to us, it's obvious, right? But to these systems, that's not obvious, okay? Because these systems have been trained in multiple human languages, and as well as computer language and other languages. So it's not obvious what language they need to respond in. Now, the system could have been designed to, by default, always use English, but that would not be the most friendly way of doing it, because if a Chinese person typed in Chinese and it responds back in English, that's not a very, very good system, right? So hidden inside the system is many prompts. So one example of a prompt would be respond in the same language that the user asked the question in. Okay. Another prompt might be an elaboration of that if the user asks a question using multiple languages, then respond either in the language that is most frequent in their text, or the language which they have written most grammatically correct. Okay, so that's a prompt that gets added into. So when I type in, what's the Earth's circumference, right? These two prompts would secretly be added into my prompt, okay, and many other prompts, would be added into there, and all of these prompts together actually go to the AI module. And so that AI module is getting this long list of things to do, not just my single question. It's getting instructions, respond to the language. Okay, so it first has to figure out what language did my question. My question was in English. So it interprets that and says, okay, the response should be in English. And that says that if they use multiple languages, it checks my prompt. My prompt didn't have multiple languages, so it ignores that. The next prompt might be that if they asked for details, provide references. Okay, I didn't ask for details, so it's going to ignore that. Another prompt might be that if they ask for personal information about a person that's living, okay, politely say you can't do that. Okay, and this is an example of some of the safety features built into these systems. Although that level of safety feature isn't sophisticated enough, they're actually trying to build in more sophisticated. But this was the first type of safety feature that they added into these systems. So anyway, so this gives you an example of that. All of these prompts and all of these additional information that's added in, hidden in a secret way into these systems, is providing it a level of awareness, of context, of the world that it's living in at that moment. That it's living in a world where there's somebody who's going to give it a question or a prompt or some information. And it's being told, like its conscious mind, or its conscious, you might say, again, not the human level consciousness, but think of it as animal level consciousness, that its animal level consciousness is being told what language to use, what level of detail to use, whether to be polite or not, whether to disclose private information about living people or not. All these types of information is being fed into its conscious mind because it's not there automatically. Okay? Now, in our minds, a lot of these things we've learned as we grew up through society. That's embedded in us. So when we're awake and living, we know these things already. And in a sense, they're in our conscious mind, in our subconscious mind. But these systems don't have those things in them yet. So that's an example of the consciousness that's added in. So anyway, so let's pause here, and we'll take some questions, answers, and we'll try to go into what we've talked about.
So folks, this is your opportunity to go ahead and ask some questions. So go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. If not, I can get it started. I'll give it. I was just wondering, actually, the one slide, if maybe explain a little more where speech can be transcribed into text, and it talks about the idea that it loses information and it loses volume. And I'm not clear as to what that exactly means. It's the slide that basically says text is only a representation, but what do you mean by information? And what do you mean by it loses volume?
Okay, so let me put the slide up again. I think this should be the one you're referring to.
The second one.
Is it this one? So the second bullet point, right?
Correct.
Speech
Yeah,
can be
second bullet point.
Okay. So when we hear someone speaking, whether it's a recording or whether it's live speech, there's a lot of information in that, right? So as I'm speaking, the rate at which I'm speaking, right, the speed at which I'm talking is a little bit of information. If I'm really talking very rapidly, it makes it harder for you to understand, right? But if I speak very slowly, it gets a little easier to understand, right? So there's a lot of information just in the speed. There's information in the intonations and the tonal quality of my voice, right? There's information in the pauses. There's information in the accent that I'm using, right? That the accent that I'm using is American accent, right? Now that doesn't really help much in terms of understanding, although you may, because if I use the word boot, then the word boot in America is different from the word boot in Britain. So, that gives a little bit of information, because if I use the word boot, you have to understand the context of that word, and you look at the rest of the sentence, but you also look at my background, and all of that together gives you information about how to interpret the word boot. Should you interpret it as a trunk of an automobile, or as a something that you wear on your feet, right? So you can. There's a lot of information that exists in speech, but when you transcribe that, when you convert that into written text, okay, a lot of that information gets lost. So if you see written text, you can't tell if the text was written by an English American speaker or a British speaker. You can't tell unless there's some additional information telling you that, right? The text alone doesn't give you that information. The text alone also doesn't have pauses built into it. Although you can artificially add pauses into written text. You can have a text, and then you can have a lot of space after it, and then you can have following text. So you can introduce spaces, and that kind of simulates or mimics the lost information that speech has. So that's basically what that's referring to. There's other types of information also in speech, but in general, speech is more information dense. Audio is more information dense, and text is less dense. So one of the ideas that's important in this slide is that when you convert from one type of information to another, you can lose information or not. And when you convert from a low density information, so for example, when you convert from speech to text, okay, so this is one of the things that we do naturally, but an artificial system doesn't necessarily know how to do this well. It has to be trained or taught how to do this. So for example, when we have written text in front of us, and we read it out loud, we automatically look at the punctuation, and we introduce pauses. And if it's a question mark, and then we change the tone of our voice to indicate a question versus not, right? Or if it's an exclamation mark, we change our voice again to show an exclamation. So the text encodes some information in there, and we convert that information to additional information in the audio version of that text. But an AI system, this is the reason why early AI systems had basically a monotone, because they couldn't get much text much more than just a simple text out of it. These modern systems can figure out a lot more from the text, not only from the fact that there's a question mark at the end. Like the very early systems couldn't do much with the question mark at all. The later systems kind of added a little bit of inflection whenever there was a question mark, but it was kind of artificial. It sounded tinny, right? The newer systems can kind of anticipate when in a question just by the fact that you have a how as the first word. They don't even have to see the question mark. Just the fact that you have a how, they start enunciating that sentence as a question from the first word onward. They don't need to get to the end of it to realize it's a question. So there's a lot more sophisticated. So that's the reason why this, when you're converting from a low information dense data to higher information medium, then these systems have to add in their own information. It has to add in its own inflection. It has to add in its own speed of reading. And these systems naturally didn't know what to do. But these newer systems have a lot of these things built into them that help them do a lot of these things. So hopefully that explains what you were asking.
I was just the thing I think that where I got a little bit confused is because volume tends to have in these models a very specific meaning, especially in how these learning models work. And then volume, the way it was described by you right there, is more related to tone, which is slightly different. They're very important distinctions because we're talking about objects in the world, then you say and what they represent, and that's all very, it gets a little bit confusing with the way it was worded. So I that's all. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, I mean the word volume, and that, yeah. So volume is actually not a lot of information, right? So volume meaning the intensity, the volumetric intensity of the audio, right? How loud is the audio? So loudness is often not used by us, right? We might use it occasionally, to emphasize something, or we might use it, someone who's shouting obviously is going to use volume. But other than that, there really isn't much information. So even a person who pronounces a single word, they may pronounce that same word using different volumetric characteristics at different times, depending on, for example, the preceding word. So if I say the word, trying to think of red, right? So the word red, now that's a homophone, okay? So red can be R-E-D, it can be R-E-A-D, right? So depending on the previous word, I might pronounce it in a different way based on the meaning that I want to impart. So if I want to impart to you a different meaning, like if a sentence has both the word R-E-D and R-E-A-D, it has both of those homophones in it, I may use volume as well as intonation to differentiate between the two. Whereas these systems prior to this didn't know that was a good thing to do or a helpful thing to do for humans. So yeah, volume was just one example. I actually, when I typed this, I thought I had intonation, but I was trying to truncate to fit on the screen.
And lengthens, especially, that's what I thought when we're talking about normally. We're talking about how we're observing things. So that's the reason why I just needed that point of clarification. So with that, I believe.
I think so. Joe, your voice was kind of garbled for a few seconds.
It's Vanessa. Well, Vanessa followed by Mike. Vanessa.
I don't know if they can unmute. Mike unmuted.
Okay, my space bar wasn't working. Is it possible that the neural networks can do a lot more with less? Because in the humans, there's something else, for lack of a better word, distraction. You have like inputs coming in. You're hungry. The wind blows. That's not really going to affect the hardware. And also, is it maybe helpful the fact that at least for the soccer playing robots in that video, they were given the one thing score, and you score that you meet the goal purpose. Humans are purpose and goal oriented. You complete it, okay, and just improve on that. The fact that's like one thing with success, even as kids are learning. You simply say, "Oh, I'll take you to the park if you do this." Okay, if I do this, I get a reward. Whereas you get success. That's what the purpose of whatever, it's the software or the robot doing that. So those things kind of combine both, goal oriented for the human, those that make it goal oriented for the object, the network, and also the fact that, it just has maybe one thing to do, or it may not be efficient energy wise, but efficient. And I just need this one thing. It doesn't matter what the lights are doing in the room, as opposed to it may give us a headache and have us sit down, and there goes 5 minutes out the window.
So yeah, I'm going to. You raise a lot of different issues there. So I'm gonna focus on the goal oriented nature and how they're good at staying focused on the goal. The example you gave of conversation with noise or wind in the background. So these systems inherently don't necessarily have goals. The goals typically are added in by the human developers, but the more sophisticated systems are actually being trained to figure out goals by themselves. So the soccer playing robots, that's an example where they inherently were not told what the goal was. They actually weren't even told what soccer is. Well, all that they were told, or the only information that they received, was that when the ball crosses a net on either side, right? Whenever the ball crosses the net, and there's a kind of sensor that lets it know when the ball crosses into the net, it gets a kind of a, you might say, positive feeling, right? It gets a reinforcement. It gets a positive reinforcement saying a good thing happened. That's it, nothing else. Okay? It doesn't know it doesn't even know the rules of the game. Okay? It doesn't even know it's playing soccer. And that system, as it was allowed to figure things out by itself, it eventually figured out how to kick a ball to make it go in a particular direction. Well, actually, let me start before that. Before that, the system had to figure out how to stand up and how to walk and how to run. So the training is long. Training is slow, but after days and months and days and weeks and months, it develops from knowing nothing at all to basically playing a very sophisticated game of pseudo soccer. Again, it doesn't follow the rules of soccer because soccer has rules and it's not going to figure out the rules. But it kind of plays a version of soccer in that different robots on the field are competing against each other to shoot the ball into the net. So each robot is trying to get a goal for itself. And the way it learns after a while is it learns it has to be able to stand and stay standing. And then it learns that it has to be able to walk. And then it learns it has to be able to run. And then it learns that it has to be able to run to the ball. Because the ball is a thing that gives you a score. The ball is a thing that gives you that reinforcement. So it basically figures out the goal. But it was never told the goal. The only thing that it was given was that a positive reinforcement when the ball crosses the net. That's as simple as you can get. That's one version. Another version is the example you gave where audio, it's listening to audio, it's listening to speech, and there's distraction, either wind or some other noise in the background. So that system will, again, depends on the training, but the training will have to, if the training data did not have these distracting sounds in the background, then that system would not be very robust because it would be able to understand speech in a quiet room perfectly. It would be very, very good at it. But the first speech that you give it, the first audio recording you give it with any kind of distraction, the sound, it'll probably totally lose it. It won't understand anything. So the training itself has to incorporate the environment that you expect that system to operate in. So the robots playing soccer, they are in an environment with gravity. Okay, if you have that same robot try to play on the space in space on our I forget the name of it now, but our the rotating space station where there's no gravity, it's not going to be able to play. Now you can retrain that system in a zero environment gravity to kind of figure things out, and it probably will figure out to some extent how to play. It'll figure out that it's floating. So it'll figure out that it doesn't have to balance anymore. It doesn't have to stand up anymore because there's no concept of standing up in zero gravity, right? So it'll learn a different set of rules, but it'll still be able to play. It'll learn a different way of playing that game in zero gravity. But it was never told about gravity. All it is it noticed that gravity, it doesn't know it's gravity. It notices that its body keeps falling down. So it has to learn how to keep its body up. It learned that. So the same token, these systems have to be trained in the environment that you want them to operate in. So if the system is so that if that soccer robots are trained in space and you bring it down to Earth, it'll massively fail because it was not trained in the environment of Earth. So this is a very important aspect to understand, is that the training is fundamental today to these systems. Just as, and the same thing applies to animals and humans, right? If we train to do something in space, like if a baby is born in space theoretically, and they live in space for the first 5 years of their life, the first time they come on Earth, they will not be able to stand up. They will not be able to balance themselves. They will not be able to walk because their brain never learned how to do those things. And that's exactly what happens with these artificial systems. It's no different. So,
thank you, Mike.
I think you've described that the important thing in the training is to have a scoring system and a set of states. Now, ChatGPT has, or Bard has all of Google, all of Bing, all of GitHub as part of its training system, and it's taken these feature stubs and put them in some sort of database. Now, the database between ChatGPT and Bard are totally different, but so is the database between Sanjay and Joe Bullock. Are totally different, but they work similarly. The issue when you ask a query to one of those systems, or when the soccer player stands up and tries to kick the nearest ball, he's finding by some nearest neighbor algorithm hashing to one of those stubs that has been built. Now, Soro has written some recent papers, some of which I've seen, but I've not seen his latest ones. And he's the guy who did the Chinese room thing. It doesn't understand what the Chinese room is all about or how to read Chinese, but it does a pretty credible job, just as the soccer player guy does a good job and ChatGPT does a good job. Now, this nearest neighbor concept and the scoring system, have you, and the representation of what that feature vector is, have you found any papers or have any insight into how to make that feature vector and what's in that feature vector that it's trying to match nearest neighbors and then score them as to which ones are relevant?
yeah, so I have a slide coming up, which, and again, this is a very complex topic, but one of the links in the meeting discussion, I think it's the second link. I don't remember the order of them, but I think it's a link which it's not there's three links. One is a video, the other is a website which has scrolling information, and the third is a PDF paper. So the second one is the scrolling website. That website has a lot of information about what you're talking about, what you're asking about. There are papers that I have which I can reference, but a lot of the papers they have a lot of technical and they have a lot of jargon that people won't understand necessarily. Excuse me. So that website I linked because it explains things in a much more understandable way for the general public. I also have one element. I have one slide coming up which will explain some of that. It'll start to help us understand the ideas around what you're asking. So some people may not even understand what you're asking because it's a very important area what you're asking. And let me do that first. Let me try to explain why it's important. So all AI systems today. So let me add one statement is that most of us see these AI systems as these chatbots. But AI systems don't have to be chatbots. They don't have to be even text-based. They don't have to deal with text at all or written information at all. An AI system can deal with any type of information. And an AI system can be designed or developed, or in effect trained. It's not the design. They're designed the same way. All of them have basically the same design, but the training is different for every AI system. So an AI system can be trained with text, or it can be trained with no text ever. It can be trained only with images, or it can be trained only with gymnastics, right? So an AI system that's trained only with gymnastics will have capability of moving in space in a sense. So it might be like a robot. So you can have an AI system that's trained with a specific type of data only, or you can have an AI system that's trained with multiple types of data. So the talk tonight is about these newer models, these newer systems which are trained with multiple types of data, not with robotics yet, but with a lot of other, I mean, there's one paper that I have that I found today, which is, again, it's a little sophisticated, so I won't reference it, but the robotic side of this is advancing just as quickly. So given that AI systems deal with information, not necessarily text. Okay, chatbots are specific to text, but there are many other types of AI systems like Wall-E, some of you may have heard of, or Stable Diffusion. These are other systems which are purely visual. They spit out an image based on what you ask it. So an AI can be designed to work on a specific single type of information or many types of information. But what that means is that each of these AI have to encode that type of information internally using vectors. Okay, and again, vector is just a fancy word for a complex table. Okay, that's all that a vector is. A simple vector can be a one-dimensional table with multiple columns. Okay, a fancy vector, a complex vector, can be a two-dimensional, like a what we think of as a table, having columns and rows, right? But theoretically, a vector can have more than 2 dimensions. It can have 10 dimensions. They can have 50 dimensions. These AI systems deal with vectors that are millions of dimensions. Okay, and that's difficult for us to understand. But if you think of one-dimensional space, two-dimensional space, three-dimensional space, right? And you extrapolate further into four-dimensional space, 1,000-dimensional space, 1,000,000-dimensional space, right? We can't imagine anything beyond 3 dimensions. Right? But that's the reason why it's so difficult for us to understand this. But mathematically, if you think of it as a table, right? If you think of a single column as one-dimensional, if you think of a table that has rows and columns as 2-dimensional, and if you think of it having a 3-dimensional, like a cube, right? Rows and columns and height, right? A cube, right? That's 3 dimensions. If you keep adding other dimensions into it, now it's difficult to imagine, but if you mathematically add these dimensions in, that's exactly what is in these AI systems. And mathematically speaking, that's exactly what exists in biological brains. Okay. Now, I have a slide coming up. I'm going to go a little more in detail when that slide is up, so I'll be able to explain it more. But Mike, is there any other part of the question that I haven't answered?
No, you've done a great job. The specific thing is when you get to these n-dimensional tables, there's a concept called KNN, nearest neighbor, as to how you find the nearest neighbor that might be the next, some of the possible alternatives of entities in that table to investigate, and then how do you score which one is appropriate, or I'll give you the best answer. So that's where I think we all get confused, and so does the system that's trying to evaluate the queries. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, these talks are not intended to delve into the artificial neural network side of things. I mean, I delve into them only to the level that I need to, but the area that you're talking about actually doesn't have to do with the pure mathematical nature of neural networks. It has to do with a specific way that these AI systems, the artificial systems, are implemented. And some teams, some companies, the search algorithm that you're talking about, some companies use different versions of that, and also the ranking system, there are many internals to these systems that are specific to companies and specific to the science, the computer science side of it, which I won't get into. I don't get into because they're not relevant for what we're talking about here. But they, in some sense, affect how these systems function. But because they're not really a part of the mathematical structure that they're based on, they don't apply to biological systems. They actually don't apply to those systems either. But they're part of the minutia of how these systems are created and how they're brought into the real world. The more the engineering and the computer science side of things. So that's why I'm not going into that too much. But anyone else? If not, we can just.
Anybody else? But why don't, it's 9:30, so why don't we do it to the second part of the presentation?
All right. Yeah.
We'll
So let me.
for discussion at the end.
Yep. Okay. So hopefully you're able to see. So what I have here is some of you may not have seen the video, but basically the video had it. So one of the things that we're starting to see with these systems, they're extremely sophisticated to the point where they are reaching and surpassing human level capability. So there's this phrase in computer science and artificial intelligence called AGI, which is AGI is artificial general intelligence. There's a G in the middle. G stands for general. So artificial general intelligence. And there's another future version called ASI, artificial super intelligence. Okay, S is for super. And these are different stages in development of AI. So AI is the broad range of all of these systems. AGI is there are two definitions of it. One is that AGI is an artificial system which can perform at the level of the average human being. Okay? So it can do generally what the average human being can do. And a different version of it is that it can do what a sophisticated human being or a specialist in a specific field can do. Okay, so either whichever definition you use doesn't really matter, because the systems today are starting to reach AGI, and some people believe it has reached AGI. In some cases, not in every case, but they're approaching AGI today. That's the belief in a large part of the community, especially if you look at the behavior that comes out of these systems. Okay, but I have some examples where we're not there yet, because these systems they still have some fundamental flaws, but over the next few months and probably over the next 2 years, they'll overcome these flaws. These systems more than likely will become AGI. They will, meaning each of these systems, each of these modern systems will surpass the average human being's capability. And then we'll start to look at ASI. ASI is a version of artificial intelligence which is beyond the capability of every human on the planet. That's the scary side of AI, which we're not going to go into. But anyway, so the next few slides I'm going to go into is trying to give us an understanding of the sophisticated understanding that these systems have today. Okay, so this is a prompt. So if you saw the video, you saw that Jeffrey Hinton, he's one of the principal researchers. He's pretty old, so he's not doing pure research anymore. He's more a spokesperson. He has communication things, but he did a lot of research early on, and he understands the field pretty well. So he used GPT-4. So right now, the most advanced system we have is called GPT-4V, V for visual, which is GPT-4 with a visual component added on. It can generate and it can also look at video. So I'm not going to go into, later on I have some slides on that, but this is just GPT-4. And the same thing applies to GPT-4V also, the video portion. It can do the exact same thing because it's based on this original GPT-4. So he asked this question to GPT-4 to try to assess its sophisticated understanding of human level problems. So it asked he typed in this prompt. And again, remember that this prompt has hidden information added into it in terms of the awareness that this has, that the prompt might say that answer the person, this question has a specific problem, which if it appears to be logical, give them a logical answer. And if they give you a very vague question, okay, assume the type of answer that you can give. And if they ask for more, and remember the answer, if they later ask for a more sophisticated answer, provide a more sophisticated answer. So these are things that are embedded within the separate area, not in the AI part, but a separate area of these systems which is part of this question. So this question isn't going into the AI alone. There are these other things that are going to the AI, but one of the things that would have been explicitly specified in that additional area is that give the reasoning for why you come up with the answer. Okay, so that's what we're going to see is the answer that it gives is a very sophisticated answer with a breakdown of the reasoning, and not just a simple reasoning, but advanced reasoning, which we'll see. So the question was, the rooms in my house. He doesn't say how many rooms. He just says the rooms in my house are painted blue or white or yellow, and then he gives it. Okay, so that's a statement. Okay, so it has to figure out what are statements and what are questions. It has to figure out what it has to do based on this input, right? So it will have to figure out that that is not asking it anything. It's giving it information. The second sentence says yellow paint fades to white within a year. It has to figure out that that second statement is, again, a statement, but it sets a rule, okay, that yellow turns to white. And it says how long, within a year. It has to know that yellow and white are things, and they're related things, okay, that paint has a characteristic of being yellow or white. And it has to know that the word fade refers to a year, okay, in that sense. It has to figure those things out. Then it has to, the third sentence is, in 2 years' time, I want all the rooms to be white, right? And that's a vague sentence, okay? If you ask this to a 10-year-old, they're going to get confused by this, because you're telling the 10-year-old, I want all the rooms in my house to be white in 2 years, and the kid's going to think, how do the rooms become white? Is there magic? Is there a genie? Is there a wizard? You know, like they're going to go into Harry Potter world or something else. They're not going to. But an adult will understand that all the information is there. You don't have to go into magical thinking. You can figure things out. It's a puzzle. Okay. And the last sentence is, what should I do? And so this AI has to figure out, that's the most important part. The person is asking me to put all of these sentences together and build a logical framework of a little world, okay, and to break down and analyze that world and understand what has to happen. Now, this doesn't really, the third sentence in a way kind of says what it has to do. It has to figure out how can all the rooms become white, or when will all the rooms become white, or how will all the rooms become white, right? So these are ideas that will have to come into its thinking for it to give an answer. Okay, so now here's the answer, and it's a long answer, but so I broke it up into I think 3 or 4 slides. So the first slide, the first part of the answer is, assuming that blue paint does not fade to white over time, and you want all rooms to be white in 2 years, here's what you should do. So this is the preface statement, okay, which again, it provides an assumption, because he didn't say that the question didn't say anything about what happens between blue and white if there's a relationship. Okay, so the AI is making an assumption that blue does not fade to white. Okay, and over time is a general across all time. Okay, it's not over a year, over 2, because if the AI didn't understand, it could have said, assuming that blue paint does not fade to white over 2 years or over a year, right? Because the question had the concept of a year. So if the AI really didn't understand the sophistication, if it didn't understand it in a sophisticated way, it might have said that it's assuming blue doesn't fade to white over a year. But it didn't say that. It said over time, which is a broader understanding of the problem. That it's saying blue never fades to white, or blue doesn't fade to white over long periods of time. So it's a little bit more. So it extracted that information out of the 4 sentences that it was given. Right? And then the next half of that sentence is, and you want all rooms to be white in 2 years. So that's a restatement of what the question was. It doesn't do anything other than restate. So it combined these 2 sentences in a fluid way using the rules of English. Assuming this and this, comma, here's what you should do. And also remember, it's using apostrophe. So it understands how to use colloquial language. It's not in a very academic or a very stinted type of language, right? It's using normal language. So there's many sophisticated layers of information that it has to deal with. Then it puts a colon. Number 1, the rooms painted in white, colon. Okay, you don't have to do anything to these. So the response is, the first part, it's numbering, it's giving a sequence. So it figured out it has to give step by step. So it's going to give number 1, number 2, number 3, like that, right? So it's doing that. And then for the first number, it's putting a preface. This refers to the room in white. Were the rooms painted in white? Because the introductory question was about 3 types of rooms: rooms in white, yellow, and blue. So I suspect it's going to have an answer for white, yellow, and blue, right? That's what you expect. So it's saying 1, about the rooms in white, here's what I want you to do, colon, okay? You don't have to do anything to these rooms since they are already white, okay? That's pretty logical. That makes sense. It's right, okay? If the room is already white and you want it to be white in 2 years, you don't have to do anything. It figured that out, okay? The next is 2. Okay, the room's painted in yellow. So again, it's continuing. Step 2, or not step 2. The second breakdown is that for the rooms painted in yellow, you don't need to repaint these rooms either, because as per your information, and here it has a more sophisticated explanation, that it's relying on the information it got from you, right? It's saying, as per your statement, as per your information, right? Yellow paint fades to white within a year. That's almost verbatim what it was told. And then says, so in 2 years, they will be white. So it makes a conclusion about the yellow rooms, that they will automatically become white, so you don't have to do anything. But the way it phrased this is that it started the sentence with the solution. It didn't put the solution at the end. If it was not a sophisticated thinker and speaker, it would say, using this logic and using this logic and using this logic, therefore you must do this. And the answer is only at the end. Right? That's when children learn to use logic, that's what they do, is they look at the information they've been given and they put all that like a geometry class. That's what you kind of do is these are the givens, this is my analysis, and this is my conclusion at the end, right? But it didn't do that. It gave the conclusion at the beginning and it kind of merged it all together into this sentence. So sophisticated understanding and language. The third is the rooms painted in blue. These rooms need to be repainted in white paint because the blue paint will not fade to white on its own. So here it's using its own assumption. It was not told anything about blue. So it's using its assumption. But its assumption is correct. If you think about it, everything so far has been correct, has been completely logical. And then it adds another paragraph, which adds to the sophistication of this. You should do this because if you leave the blue rooms, so it's commenting on the third point. Actually, it's commenting on all of them combined. So this last is a separate paragraph which combines all 3 of those colors, and it's going to explain further. It's going to give more detailed explanation. You should do this because, and this refers to this step 3. Okay, you should do step 3 because if you leave the blue rooms as they are, they won't automatically turn white. It has to understand that. Given the sentence that it was given, the 4 sentences it was given initially, how did it come up with that? Right? You have to think about it. It has to have an understanding of colors transforming over time. That's the key concept here, right? And once it got that information, then it could apply that understanding of color transformation between yellow and blue and white. And then it had to also understand that the goal is to have transformation into white in 2 years. So it has to understand not only that transformations occurred, it has to understand how quickly did the transformations occur. Yellow turns in a year. It has to understand that. So all that is, and then if you paint the yellow rooms white, so here's a part, this is actually very sophisticated, this second sentence here. And if you paint the yellow rooms white, the yellow paint that fades to white within a year could potentially mix with the white paint and give a different shade, or you'd be wasting resources by painting a room that will naturally fade to the desired color. Nowhere did he ask about resources or efficiency. Nowhere did he ask about how much it'll cost me, right? He didn't ask about any of that, but it came up with that on its own. Okay? Now, this is not canned information. This information, if you understand how LLMs work, they're not regurgitating any information off of the web. They're not doing any of that. Okay? You can take this exact same question and you can replace the word blue and yellow and white with completely made up words, which have never existed on the internet. You'll get a very similar result. Okay? Although what might happen is you might have to tell it that, like, if you refer to blue as ARR, okay, and you refer to yellow as GOOF, or you refer to as GFY, right? And you refer to white as another sequence of letters. You have to tell it that these are equivalent to colors, okay? And then it will have to add in this additional layer of understanding that this letter GFFY refers to a color which I know of as yellow. because that's what a human being would do, right? So it would have to do that. So if you do these types of things, you would realize that it's not taking canned information off the internet, because nowhere on the internet would the color yellow be referred to as GFFY. Probably never, nowhere. And if it is, it would not be in this type of specific scenario, guaranteed. So you can create scenarios where these systems cannot operate based on knowledge that's picked up off of the internet. It would not have. And these systems are not tied to the internet in the sense that they don't have access to the internet. They were trained using internet data in the past, and then they were frozen in time. Okay, that's what I said early in the talk, is that they're frozen in time. And then going forward, they're not changed. They can't change. They're frozen in time, literally. So you have to understand that. So this is pretty sophisticated. So let me just go into some more. So this is a slide that's going to go into what Mike asked about, the encoding of information. So this is an example with text. Okay, so there's 6 words on the left side here. They're small, but sea, ocean, football, soccer, I, and we. Okay, and just so and each row here corresponds to what Mike referred to as a vector. Okay, but you can think of it as table. Okay, and a table turned sideways, right? So this is a 1-column table, and each of these colors you can think of as, and at the bottom here we have a scale. Okay, this is the scale for this table, for all the tables here. Okay, you have 6 tables here. Each word has its own table, and this scale at the bottom tells us what the values in each row of this table are. Okay, so a value that's very, very dark blue, okay, is close to 1, or maybe it's 1. Okay, so this table basically has numbers in it, okay, between 0 and 1, and depending on the amount of color or the type of color it has a number encoded in it between 0 and 1. Now we can show this using numbers. Okay, we can put this exact same table and draw it using numbers. But for us, visually, reading a table of numbers is harder to do. It's easier for us to look at a table of colors, because we can see similarity in colors more easily than we can see similarity in numbers. But to the system, there's no difference. Internally, it encodes it using numbers, but for all practical purposes, it can encode it using any other format, and it wouldn't make a difference. It would operate the same way. But for human beings, we're looking at it, we encode this in numbers. And the length of this, in this case, it's about 50. There are 50 different slices, okay? But in the real world, in real AI systems, again, when I talk about these vectors being millions long, this literal vector for the word sea would have at least 1 million, probably several million, probably 100 million of these color bars across of it. Okay, so the encoding of the idea of C, not the word C, the idea of C, that's what's important here. The idea of C, okay? The encoding of the idea of C is encoded in millions and millions of numbers, okay? And that part is the same as what happens in biological brains, is that the idea of C is encoded in a cluster. And now in our brain, we have billions, 86 billion neurons in the entire brain, 16 billion in the cortex alone. But the same thing happens, that we encode information and notions and ideas in the same way using millions of neurons. Now, what happens is most of those neurons encode the most important parts of that information. So in this case, okay, one encodes important aspects of these words. So wherever you see blue or a bluish tint, well, the important aspects of this idea C. Okay, so I'm going to give you, so here we have the word sea, ocean, which are similar in nature, right? Football, soccer, which again are similar in nature. I and we, which are similar in nature. Now, if you look at the first two, they have a lot of similarity, but they're not as similar to the next two, which are different from the last two, right? So automatically, because the words, the ideas, sea and ocean are similar, the vectors have similarity internally. So the way that they're stored in the AI and the way that they're stored in our brains are similar by nature, because the information that sea and ocean conveys is very similar. So just to take an example further, that this blue bar, all of these are very, very solid blue, okay? And you might say that the first two and the middle two are dark blue, and the bottom two might be a little bit lighter shade. That's, the version that I have, it's a little more easy to see. That's what look. It's not by much. It's slightly lighter down here, but the first four are very, very dark blue. Which this row, okay, if you turn this whole thing sideways, this row you can say might encode the concept of tangibility or physicality. Okay, that are these things physical or not? Okay, so a sea, yes, it's physical. It's one. It's definitely a physical thing, right? Ocean is definitely a physical thing. Football. Now, football, the word football actually encodes more than one idea, because a football can refer to the actual ball, and football also, depending on the country you're from. In Europe, football is a soccer ball. Okay, in America, football is a different thing, right? In Australia, they have both. But the word football encodes multiple things, but here, this part of the vector only encodes whether it's a physical entity or not, whether it's a real physical thing in the world or not. And all of these cases, all of those concepts of football are a physical thing. And soccer, same thing. And the concept of I am a physical being. We is a group of physical beings, right? Or physical animals even. So all of these things encode the concept of a physical true thing in the world. Just to give an example, I don't know exactly what it encodes, but that's an example of how to look at this. This example with, let's take this darker peach colored in here, where the first two are darker, the middle two are kind of lighter, and the bottom two are kind of in the middle, right? Which middle probably means not very much at all. Like, doesn't mean no, because no would be red, right? Blue would be yes, and white would be kind of neither. It would be neutral, right? So here, this red is kind of darkish, which means that it's not. And these two are kind of a little bit less red, and these are kind of in the neutral. So this might encode the concept of, let's say, size, right? That is it something small, right? Actually, so not size. Let's pick something else. Let's pick living. Okay, living, right? So living would be a better analogy here. So an ocean and a sea are not living. Okay. Now, the reason that they are not completely red is that in our sense of the word ocean and the word sea, we also encode within it the concept that they have living things inside them, right? So that might be a reason why this is not completely dark red, right? And why it's lighter red. For football and soccer, these things are definitely not living, so it's on the reddish side. But it might be that soccer and football, now the system or the person or the brain that this encodes in, they might be fans of soccer. They might play soccer all the time. So to them, soccer and football can't exist other than people playing it. So maybe that's why it's a lighter red. But meaning non-living. So and I and we are definitely living things. Now, actually, I chose a bad example because I or we are living things. So in that case, this would be blue down here, these two, because I and we are definitely both living, right? So I was trying to think on the fly of an example, but so if you had a red, if you had a kind of a light red in the top two, dark red in the middle, and a dark blue down here in the same row of the matrix, right? In this case, it's a column. Then that might represent a concept like living. Right. So that's an example where each of these rows of the table represents a very specific concept. Now, these AI systems and our brains are not taught this. Okay, what happens is it derives this automatically from language. This is the part that's phenomenal to understand. But if you delve into this more, and we might go into it more detail, you might, if you want, we can maybe talk about it in the talk. But we're running out of time tonight. But probably in a future talk, I'll go into this a little more about how these concepts are derived simply from the words that they're trained on, or simply from the data that they're trained on. Think about how a child derives this. So if you read storybooks to a child, right? Storybooks have pictures and words and sound, and then the child also lives in the real world, and it starts to see those things that it read in the storybook. If a child reads in a storybook that there's a fireplace, but they're in their house, they don't have a fireplace. Right? Where does a child see it? Well, they might see it on TV one time, or they might go to a friend's house where there's a fireplace. So the child learns about a fireplace in a storybook. They have no idea what it is because it doesn't look like much. It's just this reddish thing, And then they see it in a video, and they see the camera moving around. They kind of see a 3D mesh aspect. And then they go to a friend's house, and they actually physically see a real live fireplace, and they get to see a little more of it. And then they have a better understanding. So as we live life, as we experience the data around what's living and not living, and what's tangible and not tangible, those things encode these concepts of tangibility and living things. And parts of speech, for example, is this a pronoun, or is this a noun, or is this a verb? Those concepts also get encoded into this. So all these things that we understand about the world are encoded in our brain, and the same patterns are happening in these AI systems in basically the same way. Okay, so that's something very important to understand. The next few slides are a little faster. So this slide is something that's, so this is the most recent version of GPT-4, which is called GPT-4V, which has the visual component. It literally can see things that you give it. It doesn't have camera eyes, but if you give it a text, image, it basically looks at it and it can see and understand the image. So what this shows is on several different areas, and this is where this system was compared to humans on different battery of tests, which assess the capability of people. So this first test is what's known as theory of mind. It's a test in psychology which is given to people, to assess their understanding of human beings and other animals and things. So theory of mind basically is your understanding that other people and other animals even have a separate mind from your, and that their mind can have a different idea about things, that they can have a different conception. So if you know something, the other person might not know it. A 2-year-old child doesn't understand that. That's why if you hide something from a 2-year-old child, they think it's literally disappeared from the world. And if you bring it back, they think, wow, it appeared out of nowhere magically. They don't understand that just because you hid it, it's hidden behind it, but it stays there. They don't understand that. So concept of mind and object permanency, there are many concepts under this that we learn as we age. By the teen years, we mostly understand it. So humans score about 87 out of 100. All these are on a 100 scale. They've been normalized to 100 scale. So most average humans have around 87, which is not great, but it's still not bad. ChatGPT-4V scored 100. It has a very sophisticated and pretty much complete understanding of minds. Right? Now it gained by doing tons and tons of reading of all this stuff off the internet around the US Bio-Olympiad, which is a test of the knowledge of biology, sophisticated biology, college level biology. Introductory college level, not graduate level. The average human being has about 50, scores 50 on the test. ChatGPT scored 99.5, almost perfect. Okay. On a test of creativity, the average human scores 50. ChatGPT-4V scored 99. Again, almost perfect. On SAT, many people in the US know it. Average student scores 50, and ChatGPT scored 94. Okay. This is actually this is ChatGPT. Sorry, this is GPT-4, not V. But anyway, and the reason why it's not higher than 94 is because that's the reason why they added this V component, because a lot of SAT test questions have visual information on them that you need to look at to understand the problem. And that's why the original version, this label at the top is wrong. This is only for GPT-4, not GPT-4V, as it shows in the top right corner here. And this last is a totally different type of test. This is a test, but this test is only given to the students who study to be a sommelier, who is somebody who understands, has significant knowledge in wines of the world and everything related to wines. And the average sommelier student scores around 50, okay, 50 percentile. And GPT-4 scored 77.1%. So again, above the average understanding already. This is GPT-4, which was in March of this year, it was released. It's been, 6-7 months since then. And GPT-4V, more than likely, is higher in all of these scales. Here's some example of GPT-4V, which has a vision component. So here's a prompt it was given. Okay, it was given this photo, okay, of apples, and it was told count the number of apples in the image. And the answer it gave is there are 12 apples in the image. Now, if you count them, that's wrong because the last row only has 3. Okay, but it's totally wrong. Okay, so this is an example where it didn't pick 12 randomly, because basically it probably made an assumption that the first row has 4, the second row has 4. This looks like a grid, so therefore it must have 12. Okay, or it may be that for various reasons the answer 12 is kind of close, but it's not exactly correct. Okay, this is the same question. It was given the same thing again. Again, count the number of apples in the image, and then it was given additional information. Let's think step by step. So it was told to think through the problem step by step. It was given instructions to think through the process, like when you teach a 12-year-old, how do you break down a complicated problem? You think through it step by step. That's what it was told. It was given this additional instruction, think through it step by step. And this is what GPT-4V did. Step 1, look at the image and identify. So this is telling itself, and then it actually did these things. Step 1, look at the image and identify all the apples, right? So identify where all the apples are, and only apples, nothing else, ignore everything else. Then it was told, start counting the apples one by one, okay? Make sure not to miss any apples, or not to count the same apple twice, right? Because these are obvious things that we know, but it's telling itself, it's kind of making a list for itself of what to do step by step. And it's a very logical, it's a coherent list. And then step 4 is, after counting all the apples, double check to make sure the count is correct. So this is optional, right? Children, if given this problem, wouldn't probably include that, right? To double check your answer. But because it's sophisticated, because it knows that it might make mistakes, it added that step for itself. Problem is, even though it looked at all these steps, it still got the answer incorrectly. It still says there are 12 images in the apple. Okay, so in that sense, it's doing a lot of sophisticated things, but the vision part, which is the newest part here, still isn't that sophisticated. Probably in another generation, it will be much more sophisticated, and it'll ace this without a problem. I just have a few more versions. We're close to the end here. So then, because it failed twice, it was given another chance. Count the number of apples in the image. Let's count the apples row by row. So it was given explicit instructions to do it row by row. So it says, first row, 4 apples. Okay. Second row, 3 apples. Now that's wrong if you can see. Okay. Third row, 4 apples. Now, either it's mistaking what a row is, okay, or it's miscounting, or something else is going on that's confusing it. Or maybe it isn't interpreting the image. Maybe it's looking at the image in a sideways fashion or upside down fashion. We don't know exactly. Okay? So something's going wrong. The interpretation of the image or interpretation of the rows, it seems to be off. And then it says total number of apples in the image 11. So it happens to get the right answer, but for the wrong reason. Okay, so that's still a fail, right? Here's the last, and it's got to correct this time. So it's being given instructions. You are an expert in counting things in the image. Okay, it's being told explicitly, you have to behave like you're an expert in counting things in images. Okay, let's count the number of apples in the image below, row by row, to be sure we have the right answer. Now here it's not being told how many, tell me the answer, that's kind of implied, but it figures out row 1, 4, row 2, 4, row 3, 3, total number 11. This time it got it right. Now, there's another part of this that you may not realize. It was given 4 different chances to do this. Now, ChatGPT 4V has what I termed focus and attention, okay, and has sophisticated focus and attention, which means it remembers things from the past. So more than likely, and I know that all of this was done in the same session. So the fact that it missed it the first time, it missed it the second time, missed it the third time, each time it remembers what happened the previous time, or not remember completely, but has some semblance of memory of what happened the previous time. So this 4th time, it's learned a lot from each of those failures. And this is what happens with children, right? Every time you give it something, gets a wrong answer, it learns, and eventually it gets it right. And eventually it figures out by making mistakes, it eventually figures out what to do. So if you ask this the 5th time, chances are it would be correct from this point on. But then if you turn off ChatGPT and start from scratch again, where it doesn't have that memory, it doesn't have that pseudo-conscious awareness of what's happening in this world, in this make-believe world of apples and counting, right? If it doesn't have that, it's going to start again with probably failures, or it might pass the first time. But if you try this experiment 10 times, probably 7 or 8 or many of those 10 times it's going to fail, just as it did here. That's the state of this element. Almost at the end. So here are other aspects of vision. So here it was given a picture, and this is an example where you can paint and draw something or point to something on the image and tell it to focus on it. So it was told within this yellow area, what does it describe? It says describe the painted region of the image, nothing more. So it has to figure out what's the painted image. It has to figure out the painted image. It wasn't told the painted image the painted part is in yellow. It wasn't even told that, right? It has to. So if you're looking at this, you and I can tell this yellow part is kind of not very imagey. It's not like photorealistic, right? It looks like someone drew it in jagged lines. So it had to figure that out by itself. It wasn't told, use a yellow line and tell me what's inside the yellow line. It was not told that. It had to figure that part out by itself. It also had to figure out that part relates to the rest of the image and what's the context of this in relation to the rest of the image. So it had to understand the overall image. Then it had to zoom in and focus in on that area and had to give a relative description between that area and the rest of the image, giving you a context that how a human analyze this image? And the answer is the painted region of the image is a row of hanging lights on a wire. So you can see the wire, right? And you can see the wire extends past and goes to another pole, etc. So it may have had to make those types of assessments that wires, don't just hang in empty space. They kind of connect over. The lights are small and round, and they are evenly spaced along the wire. The wire is stretched between two poles and is located above a patio area with tables and umbrellas. The lights appear to be decorative and are likely used to provide ambient lighting in the evening. So this picture is not about evening, but it kind of figured out that lights are used to illuminate when it's dark. And it knows that evening is a situation when the outdoors becomes dark and you especially need lights outdoors because the sun goes away. So it has to understand all of these things about evening and the purpose of lights in an outdoor space. And the fact that this is a patio space, it has to figure out it's an outdoor space. So there are many, many levels of understanding it has to come up with on its own, simply looking at this one picture and this one sentence above it. So that's pretty advanced. Here's a table. Okay, so again, it has to extract numbers. So I'm not going to go in detail, but basically describe the pointed region in the image. Again, it doesn't know because these lines and rectangles might be the pointed region. It has to figure out, is it the rectangles that are pointing or something else? And then it goes into and it eventually says that but it focuses on the bottom number in this image. So this is a little bit of an error because the prompt doesn't talk about the bottom number. It talks about the whole region, right? But the answer focuses on the bottom number. So a little bit of error, but in general, it kind of did what it was asked to do. The last is the last. So this is the most sophisticated of all. Answer the question in the following figure. Provide information steps, intermediate steps. So here it's being told that there is a question. It's not told how many questions there are, okay? But it's told answer the question in the following figure. So it's not being told that there are multiple questions. It's actually being told there's only one question, okay? But it figured out that there's two questions in the figure, okay? It was told, because the word question is singular. It doesn't refer to more than one. So it was told, answer the question in the following figure. Provide intermediate steps. And this is basically a problem in geometry, which you might find in the SAT, okay? And I checked the math, it's completely correct. What it basically did is it knows about the Pythagorean theorem. It knows about that cotangent is the opposite over adjacent, and that's what it used. It used those two elements, and it knows how to do mathematics. Okay? It knows square root and square, etc., because the Pythagorean theorem requires square root, and it gave an approximation. So approximation of square root of 80 is 8.94. Okay. And it says approximately, okay, it uses the word approximately. So it knows the difference between 8.94 exact and 8.94 approximate. So many levels of sophistication in this example. So anyway, that's the end of the slide. So we can talk about this if we want.
Feel free to either type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. We ran a little bit over time, but I would like to, just get a couple questions in here. So we will start with Vanessa.
Yeah, I noticed the one with the apples. A couple of things. I think DLJ also mentioned it may not think 1, 2, 3 the way we do. It may say top, bottom, middle. But if you looked at that last row, they kind of lined up, to the corners, and the middle apples were on the larger side. So just to quickly glance at it, it's like, it takes up about the same amount of area. And so not realizing, okay, like if you were to glance at that quickly, okay, there's 4 there, it takes up the same length, and not realizing that the larger apple is what, made it have that same length. But it's like I said, I guess they eventually realized the thing, but even we're making assumptions, we're saying, 1, 2, 3, okay, we think you read from top to bottom, versus they could have been thinking, okay, top row, look at the bottom, then look in the middle. It's because maybe more the edges matter more to it. So we're making assumptions as well. Yeah,
so I can't comment on why that happened, but just to say that the information this is based on is a paper that's brand new. I mean, in terms of academic papers, it's less than a month old. And the work was done just prior to that, in the last 2 or 3 months. So it's really, really new work. And they probably don't know exactly what happened internally. They can delve into it, but it takes a lot of time and it takes new tools. We need new tools. The research teams need to develop new tools to kind of drill into the AI model. Just, we don't have tools to drill into a human brain or into an animal brain because it's so sophisticated. The same thing that these AI brains are unique. So you need tools to drill into them to kind of figure out what's happening, and they don't have that yet. But we can speculate. I would say that probably it has an understanding of what an apple is, because all of these apples are reddish. And you have to remember that the sense it gets of the world and the context of the world is based on text that it's gotten off the internet. And the description of the world on the internet is sophisticated enough, and it's been replicated in enough times, meaning probably millions of times. Now, the concept of an apple, it's probably read billions and multiple billions of times off the internet. So the concept of an apple, it probably has solidly equivalent to any person. The concept of counting, it might have to some extent, but counting is not something that is explained very well on the internet. Right? There are specific sources, but to understand those, especially if it's in complicated language, it needs sophisticated language. So it might get into a catch-22 situation where it needs sophisticated language to understand the definition of something as simple as counting, right? So the concept of counting might be where the problem is. I think the counting of rows it probably has, but what might have been is the spacing of the apples. That might have been something where, we think of rows as in our mind, we draw a line along a row. It might not be doing that. It might not know that that's a trick that we like a child in school sometimes is told by a teacher, that if they have a visual processing difficulties, children have difficulty in different things. So a child who has a difficulty might be guided by their teacher. Use these helpful tools. Imagine a line drawn through the apples. Imagine a second line through the second row, a third line through the third row to differentiate between them. But this system hasn't done that. Now, if you add that into your prompt, I suspect that's going to help it, because just as it helps a child. So these may be the reasons why it couldn't do it. I don't think it's because it doesn't know what apple is, or I think the low level stuff it's gotten down pat. It's the higher level things that it's messing up on right now, and those will be solved in the next few months.
So next up, we have Madeline.
Yes, thank you, Sanjay. This was really, I can't believe how much information you got in here. And it was much more interesting than I thought it would be. Usually I kind of roll my eyes when it comes to the AI stuff. So two things. One is, as far as counting goes, perhaps when AI is embedded in robots, counting and gets feedback that way, it will come much more naturally to it, because for us, counting is a physical thing that we do as very young children by touching objects. And so we operate in an entirely different realm than it does.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to point out that it behaved very much like a human being does in terms of the room painting question, because in fact, no information was given about the blue rooms. The blue rooms could turn pure white in 6 months. But it made the same assumption, of course, that I did initially, which was you'll have to paint the blue rooms white. But then DLJ put something in chat, and I thought, oh, wait a minute. It has no information about that. We don't know anything. So it not only made the same assumption that a person would, rather than saying, and I have no information about the blue rooms, which would be the logical thing. And furthermore, it assumed that you wanted more advice than you were asking for. And it had advice about paint fading, and maybe this won't be the right color. So really, it was just as bad as asking a person.
Or a scientist.
In other words, it made assumptions, it gave advice you didn't ask for. So yeah, in that respect, I guess it's becoming more human. But if we want it to behave accurately and logically and give correct answers, then that isn't quite the right track.
So yeah, excellent point. So on the last point, there are other chatbots out there which, to a much better degree, behave as real people. If you ask it a sophisticated question, a lot of these chatbots will give you a flippant answer, or they might say, "Are you really want to know that?" Or it might say, "I'm not really sure. Let's figure it out together." Or it might give an answer that more, you know, normal people would give. So there are AI systems that have been trained to be more human-like. This specific system, GPT-4, and a lot of its competitors have been trained to be experts. That's the reason why. And also another part is that we don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that when I describe the hidden consciousness part of it that's added in later, you know, not within the core AI, but it's added in a separate module. That part more than likely is where it's been told that if the question is of a certain nature, and I kind of hinted at this before I went into this, that, you know, if you're asked a question that involves logic, give a logical, detailed answer. Like it might have that as part of its prompt. So even though the question didn't have that, automatically the creators of the system add that into your question, into that paint question. It's automatically added in. So the AI portion gets that paint question about the rooms, as well as this additional information that if you're given a logical problem, break it down into steps and explain the steps in detail. If you remove those additional elements, and the previous version of the system that didn't have it actually behaved in that way, that if you asked it a question like that, it might say that I'm not sure what to do because you didn't tell me anything about blue. Okay, because that's what a person would do, right? Or a more informed person would say, you didn't tell me about blue, but I'm going to assume something about blue. So this is my assumption, and this is the answer I'm giving you based on that assumption. That's what it did. So there's many different levels that it can happen in. But I think that some of the behavior we see is because it has this additional element. I don't want to call it consciousness, but it's an area of focus and attention which characterizes biological systems, biological beings, which is a very important part, and which helps us to interact better. And I think they added that in a way to make it behave like an expert, but that can be changed to make it behave like anybody else. Another thing that you raised about, so there's one more thing when you were talking about the numbers and counting. So, I mean, there's so much around this that I'm going to raise in future talk, but I want to add this one thing, is that you were talking about that it doesn't have a physical understanding of the world, and that's key. That's a key idea to understand here, is that these AI systems today, not only do they not have an understanding of the physical world, they have no concept of the physical world. They don't understand there is a physical world. Their understanding of the universe is the same as a person's understanding is when they're reading a fictional story. So when you pick up a book to read a fictional story, okay, you set aside your understanding of the physical world and you delve your mind into the story, and you understand that this fictional story can be sci-fi, it can be supernatural, it can be a fantasy, it can be any kind of fiction. It can be fiction about anything that's not real. And you put away your understanding of the physical world and you delve into the story, and everything that's in the story you believe and you accept, and it creates its world. And you stay within that world while you're reading the story, and things are entertaining. Right? So these AI systems, that's what they perceive the world as a story. Okay? And this is part of the reason why when you see hallucinations and dishonesty or not telling the truth, things like that, this is the reason why, because they don't have an understanding about truth. See, only if you know that there's a physical world will you understand there's a concept of truth. If you only know that you're living in a fantasy world, anything can be true, right? And for that matter, something written doesn't have to be even true because it's written. It's just written. That is, if you ask a character in a story that says, well, something's flying, and you ask that character, well, is it really flying? Because flying isn't true. The character in the story is going to look at you and say, what, are you weird? This is a make-believe story, right? Anything can happen. And that's in effect what happens inside the quote-unquote minds of these systems, is anything can happen. They're trained to not understand that there are restrictions on the physical world. They don't understand that part yet. That's where, the embodiment is one way that can happen, but there are other ways that they're working on also. So we have to give them an understanding about the limitations in the physical world, which they don't have yet. They think of the world as a fantastical story where anything can be true. Therefore, their answers sometimes actually have total nonsense in them. So yeah, great points.
Do we have Vanessa next? Or wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at it much earlier. Exclamation point. What about the? I'll just ask really quickly about the idea that of concept drift, and how these models actually are actually performing worse over time.
I missed the word, Joe. You said
Concept drift. It's concept drift. I can actually put a paper in that was cited, that was recently cited, how it is actually performing worse in mathematics specifically, over time. And then so how that is basically the data that it's trained on is somewhat it's usually because of time that it's being degraded. But in this particular instance, it was interesting because it was mathematical. I can put the Stanford paper in there.
Yeah, but
I know what you're talking about. I know that I fully understand what you're talking about.
Can I just say that's actually very human? I used to be very good at maths. The older I get, the worse I get. It is actually mimicking us humans.
And believe it or not, it's actually human-like in another way also, because children show the same pattern when they're learning. Up to a certain point, their rate of gained knowledge is very high, and after the amount of information they have, that rate of increase saturates and actually may decrease depending on if you for example, if you inundate a child. This is the reason why we have a school year is truncated. It doesn't continuously go, month after month after month. That's why we have breaks, because if you inundate a child's brain with information, it becomes less efficient and it starts to actually lose information. Even though summer breaks also is a different reason why we lose information, why children lose information. If you inundate them, what's happening in these systems is different. The aspect you're talking about is very different from what we've talked about tonight. Okay, what we've talked about tonight is the systems after they're completely built and flushed out and basically put into the world. Okay, they're finished systems. What you're talking about is the system under development, the system under training. But it's very true, and it's completely true. But the reason why that happens is a completely different reason. That's more akin to what happens with people and animals. And the reason why it happens the same way is because the mathematical model is the same. Okay? That if you think of it this way, that if you had 100 neurons, right, theoretically the capacity of information that those 100 neurons could encode would be up to a certain point, right? So let's say on day one with these 100 neurons, you give it information, okay, and next day, and you don't give any time to process and kind of coalesce and make that information efficient. You're like giving information day after day without giving it a break. So you give it information on day one, day two, day three. You keep giving information until it reaches 80% saturation. So 80% of those neurons are kind of used up now. It doesn't work that way. It's not that neurons get used up, but let's say that 80% of those 80% of the information that all of those neurons together can encode has been encoded. Okay, so 80% of it is done. Okay, now as you give it more and more information, the additional information has to kind of take away from the information in those 80%. Some of those 80% of knowledge, the neurons that have that 80% of knowledge, have to be undone for you to add more information, because that information can't go into just the 20% remaining. That information has to be mixed into all 100 of those neurons. So for you to add this new information into all 100, some of those 80 that were trained already, or isn't going to be exactly 80, but 80%, but whatever number of neurons that were trained, the knowledge of each of those neurons will have to be decreased a little bit to add a little more to it. Okay, so that's why, and this is through mathematics, any system that has a maximum capacity, so that's why I gave 100 neurons in this example. There's a maximum theoretical capacity that you can show using numbers, very clear numbers. If you come up to even 70% of the capacity of that theoretical limit, and then you go beyond it, you'll have a drop. This is mathematically demonstrable. So, and this is why it happens in people and animals, and it'll happen in insects. It'll happen in anything that has a neural network to make its decisions on. So that's why humans we evolved by having larger brains. we couldn't make our brains more efficient. We've literally had to add more neurons to our brain to become smarter. That's the reason. And that's what they're doing with AI. They're adding neurons more and more.
I'm just wondering, well, if anyone here saw that article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on the law of increasingly functional information.
Yeah, I read about it. I didn't see the paper, but yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of you, Sanjay. I thought it would make a really cool topic for one of your presentations.
Yeah.
I was thinking about what you said about these things treating the world as like the way we read fiction. I think it's a pretty good metaphor, but like most metaphors, it doesn't map one to one.
Right.
And I think one of the problems with it again is the body, because when we're reading fiction, any halfway decent author is going to put in some sensory details that draw you in, something smells or tastes or sounds or something that's going to activate the mirror neurons or some kind of response in your own body. And that's not happening it's almost like formal logic is having elements put into it that are creating a fictional world, but they don't really mean anything to it in the same way that they mean something to us in terms of things we would do or feel.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's good analogy. I mean, so another way to look at it is in some purely fiction stories, they present ideas that we can't even imagine. Okay, like I mean, so in today's science fiction, we all have heard about wormholes, but 200 years ago, a story that had the concept of wormhole or time travel would have been very different from how we see today. So a reader back then would not have understood, or a reader today who's introduced to a very sophisticated concept like multi-dimensional multiverse. Most people don't really understand what the multiverse encapsulates. They think of universes, but it's much more complex than that, because we can't imagine it. And there are lectures that authors and scientists give on the nature of the multiverse, which, if you listen to them, will blow your mind, because the simple version of a multiverse that most of us have is not what a more complex version is. So same thing happens that even in the stories we have today. Now, authors usually don't do that because it's so difficult to explain, because if it's an important element for the plot and the readers don't understand it, you kind of locked yourself into a storyline that doesn't go very far. So authors don't do that a lot. But with these AI systems, they don't have any choice. They don't know there's a world out there. We do. We treat them as if they know the world, and we give them information as if they know the world, and we describe things as if they have a more holistic understanding of the world when they don't. And so they're at a disadvantage in that sense. But that disadvantage will go away as they gain a more robust and complete understanding of the world.
I have just one last question, and it's not, I mean, it's somewhat related, but I think you can actually answer it. You did talk about a little bit about graph theory, and how do like RDF triples factor into this? Triple store, essentially, technology.
So I'm not sure what
subject, predicate, object.
Joe, can you repeat your question? A truck just went by.
No, so essentially we were talking about graph theory a little bit earlier, and there's these RDF graphs where there is basically semantic, like that's how we extract information from web and other things as well. But it's just a subject, predicate, and object, and it starts to put ideas into context. How does that factor into things like ChatGPT?
I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do a good job answering that. I mean, so I can try to. So the slide that I had where you looked at the tokenization of information. You want to pull up?
Right.
So that slide. So that slide applies to any type of information. And that was specific to words. I'm trying to pull it up, but it was specific to words, but it applies to anything. It's not only limited to words, because that slide, let me try to bring it up. That slide refers to all, it's the same concept. I think it's visible now, right? It refers to this. This is how all information is represented in artificial and biological. We believe it's the same in biological. It seems to be the same in biological networks. So in graph theory, what you're looking at is the interrelationships between parts of the network, parts of the graph, okay? How they relate to each other, how they interact with each other, how they can change each other. So in this example, let's say that, I'm trying to think of an example that's going to be, let's say let's say this is in training, at the time of training of the system, okay? Because I think it applies more then. So these are 6 words that the system already knows about. And let's say that we only have these 50, each vector is 50 information pieces left. The depth of each vector is 50. And let's say you want to add a 7th piece of information into this. You want to teach it a 7th idea. Okay. So for it to understand the 7th idea, so if you think about these 50 columns in this vector space. Okay, this vector space consists of 6 rows, 6 words, and 50 columns. Right, each word has 50 columns in it, and we want to add a 7th row of a new word. Okay, now in reality, the actual network, the actual graph, will not be related to 6 or the number 50. Okay, the network can be composed of any number of nodes. Okay, it's irrespective, and the number of nodes that you choose determines the sophistication of information that network can store. Okay, so in this case, we want this network to store at least 50 columns of 7 rows of data. Okay, so using the mathematics, you're going to come up with a minimum number of nodes that your graph has to have, and that's going to let you just store these 7 pieces of information. Okay, but more sophisticated information, much more sophisticated behavior isn't just knowing about 7 different ideas. It's the relationship between these 7 different ideas and how these 7 different ideas interrelate and how can you use them together. So that's when you start getting into the subnodes, the subnetworks. And so you have to be, so your network has to be designed, and the way that the data is, I mean, the conceptualization of the data, the encoding of the data is pretty straightforward. It's very simple. It's simple. It's just vectors. It's vectors of millions of parameters, and you have many of these vectors in billions of neurons. But when you're talking about comparing, so the question that you asked is more getting into how do you compare or interrelate, let's say, the first word with that 7th new word that you added into your graph, right? And that comes into with the training and how you do the training and the nature, the topology of your network. That gets into sparse networks and dense networks. I'm not an expert in this area, but the nature of your, so in biological systems, this is one of the reasons why in human beings and animals, when we're born, our brain actually has many more neurons because the network grows beyond what it needs to grow. The connections between these 7 words or 6 words will be very dense in the beginning as a child, the first 4 or 5 years of life. And then around the 6th, 7th year of life, the brain, the child, the mind starts to trim down and trim off a lot of those interconnections. Because by that time, it's kind of figured out enough about the world and what the world is like. And it has to add more data and more density and more detail in, so it starts to pare down. So the topology of that graph physically has to change during training. And that's one of the limitations, is that today that doesn't happen in AI. Okay? In AI, when you start off with a structure for the graph, during the entire training session, it stays. Nothing changes. And what we're doing is, this is possibly a mistake, or it may be causing the limitation, but because of the way we do the training and we don't modify nature and structure of the graph itself, of the network itself during training, that imposes a lot of problems. Whereas in the biological systems, it does prune itself. It does change the structure over time. Again, I'm probably not doing a good job here, but the part that I understand, that I can relate to, that I can explain, tells me that it's very, very difficult to do in AI, and it's done automatically in biological systems. We don't even understand how sophisticated it is. So that's why we don't even try to do it in artificial systems, because we don't know how it automatically happens in brains. But that may be an area of improvement if we can start, just as before, one area of improvement in these artificial systems was we started to modularize. We started to, just our biological brains have regions, and they have specialized types of neurons. Now, these artificial systems still don't have specialized neurons. They still have one basic definition of a neuron that's cascaded across. That's another area where we might be able to add to. I don't think that's necessary. I think that the pruning aspect may be one area that we can improve training. Not the final functioning, because the training aspect right now is very inefficient, it's very difficult. And as we're training, we see a lot of problems during training, just as you described, that it unlearns things, or it becomes muddled and it becomes confused. So these are things that might be improved during training. And validation, which is another part of training. So anyway, that's
the metal inhibitor.
Yeah, this is a very dense area.
I think there's also a distinction between directed and, it's that the RDFs are direct. That is a distinction to be made between what you're talking about, I think, versus what I'm talking about. But I just knew the two fit together. I'm just not exactly seeing how they work within large language models just yet.
So I see in chat you added, is that the paper you're referring to?
That's not a page, that's just the wiki page. So, I mean,
I didn't get a chance to look at it yet. Oh, it's a PDF.
No, that's the paper from regarding the concept that was written this past August about how actually ChatGPT is actually doing a little bit, not doing as well as in math as it initially had done.
Well, that's prior versions. Chat. So it's not Chat.
I thought it was 4 actually.
So 4 does a much better job. I mean, there's still problems in it, and again, this is because of the concept of numbers. The concept of numbers and enumeration and infinity, and math is very complex, and even humans have difficulty. So this system still has difficulty, but it's much better than before. Like the simple math problems, it can do more or less always. But so that's why I think that counting problem with apples was not as much about counting itself. It may have been more about the visual nature of it, or the problem of how do you focus on what a row is. Like when I described it, for children, we tell them, imagine a row having a line through it. Draw a line through all the apples in the same row. Draw another line through the apples in the second row, like that. Those are techniques that we have, learned and teach ourselves. But this doesn't have any of those. But either we can give it those shortcuts, or we can give it a more robust understanding of what it means to count or number theory. And number theory is very much more advanced than simply counting. So it has nascent understanding of a lot of mathematical concepts. Even though like geometry, it did a fantastic job with that problem, but that's because that's a limited domain. There weren't a lot of things. It had to basically understand basic elements of trigonometry and how to interpret a line. A triangle is a very simple shape. But if you give it a more complicated shape or a very complicated geometry problem, it would probably fail right now. But in about a year of further development, you'll be better at solving those problems also. So we're on a path of improvement with these systems, same as with biological systems. When a child in 4th grade can solve some logic problems, but not most. And by the time they get to 10th grade, they can solve a lot of them, not all of them. And if they go to graduate school, they can solve, most of the complex ones that are known to man. That incremental set of improvements through training is what has to happen to these AI systems. The training is ongoing. And at the same time, underneath the research side of it, they're changing the intrinsic how we train and how they're physically designed. The structure of the neurons. A lot of things are being done in research, and then these additions of concepts of awareness and other things that are being added in. These are all adding in elements of biology or biological networks that we know about that we can start to implement now. So they will get closer and closer to full human capability.
I have a question that's related to this and to what Joe was asking. As I recall, Sanjay, in one of your earlier presentations, I doubt you have the slides to hand, it was that really lovely one with all the visuals about how different neurons connect to each other. It had regions and hubs and regional hubs, and they connected in different ways and were powerful in different ways. And I'm wondering if the programmers of ChatGPT only use one type or if they use different types. I'm assuming they conceptualize it in that same way. And also if any of these AI things actually decide to start reconfiguring themselves in a different way, in the type of neural Darwinism you're talking about in human brains, if they ever decide to switch over to some entirely different mode because it would be more efficient?
Yeah, so the first part about their actual development today and what computer scientists are doing. So these systems are not really programmed. There is something called programming that's done, but that programming is not for the AI part. The programming basically creates a structure which can encode a neuron and multiple neurons in like the vector space. So there is programming done, but the programming has nothing to do with AI. Programming simply allows us to represent neurons and represent multiple neurons and represent the connection between neurons. That's all that the programming is. But the actual AI development is basically only done during training and retraining and retraining and retraining. There are many layers and levels of training, many types of training. A lot of the training is done automatically using pure data. Then there are other training that's done by bringing people into the loop where people actually interact with the system and kind of teach it and tell it and guide it about yes or no and yes or no, things like that. Many levels of training, but training is really where pretty much all of the development of an AI system happens. So the second part of your question, actually the first part also touched on this, as far as the topology and the structure of the network. Again, right now they're not doing anything with that other than before they, in the programming part, when they actually write a program, that program has in it the physical size of the network, meaning how many neurons it'll have, whether the neurons are in a 2-dimensional grid or a 14-dimensional grid or a 40 million dimensional grid. Okay, it has that in the code. Okay, and once the code is run, then inside of it, it creates this 14-dimensional or 40 million dimensional grid. It creates that grid inside in the numbers in mathematics, and then that brain exists, that network exists. And then they start pumping data into it. They start training it. And that data kind of finds its way all over that 40-dimensional network. Okay? And they're not telling the data to go anywhere. They're not moving the data into places. They're not doing anything with it. All they're doing is they're dumping the data in. They're shoveling in it literally. They're shoveling in the data. And the data naturally finds its own place. Okay, this is what's hard to understand, but same thing happens in biological systems, except there's a little bit more with biological systems because our sensory physical senses are based in physical locations. So our ears and the auditory nerve and auditory canal, all of these are in a physical geographic location. This is the reason why the temporal and the prefrontal temporal parietal regions, which are closest to those nerves, are the ones that encode auditory information because physically they're nearby. Okay? And although our visual system is a little bit different, our visual system actually is all the way in the back, but that's because historically our brain, when we're animals, our brain was not like human. Our brain, human brain, the cortex is in the front, but prior animals didn't have that. So the rear brain was actually closer to the front. In our brain, the eye actually drills through. They're literally, they're not holes, but they're like tunnels through the brain that a lot of the nerve bundles go through. So anyway, so the structure of the brain is created by the scientists, but that structure is nothing like the physical structure of the brain. So that's why in our physical brain, information that's stored does find its place in specific locations. For example, that's why our parietal lobes are primarily dealing with spatial information and information about personal us and our personal space and things like that related to that space and location and us. Those are the types of concepts it's related to. And part of it is because of how our body interfaces with our brain in the specific locations. So these systems don't have any kind of those types of limitations, or they're virtually defined. That's why when the information gets shoveled in, they don't go to specific places. Whereas in us, when our ear hears sound, it literally goes first into our temporal areas. That's why those areas become in a child, an infant, those areas become the auditory processing centers. But that's why a deaf person, those areas tend to become visual centers because their ears, their auditory system doesn't work. Those areas are unused, and the visual system takes over those areas because it doesn't matter. The same neurons can do the same different function. So we see the same plasticity in biological systems, but biological systems have a lot more rigidity. I use the term hardwired because our DNA has hardwired where our ears are and where they connect into our brain, or where our brain grows around the auditory system. So all those things are intermixed into biological, but in the artificial side, there's no such structure. Anything can happen. So when they shovel the data in, the data kind of finds its own place. And so after you're done training, if you take the same program on a different computer, right? And these are supercomputers. If you take a second supercomputer and do the exact same training, chances are that where the concept of living resides in your first system, the cluster of neurons where it resides in the first system, chances are that it will not be in the same location in the second system. It'll be in a totally different random location. But there will be a notion of living in this system. There will be a concept of living in that system. But they probably will almost never be near each other because these systems don't have a physicality to them. They're truly virtual inside, whereas our brains are very, very physical. That's why the concept of me is in the parietal lobe in pretty much every human being and a lot of animals too. So anyway,
Thank you.
We're going to a lot of areas, but
well, you covered a lot of material. So with that, we will call it a night. I think we've actually gone a little bit over our time. So tired that he put his glasses on. So that's it's so that's time to say goodbye. Anyway, just a note for what is coming up this weekend, or tomorrow, I should say. We have we're continuing our series on Joseph Campbell, and that'll be led by Brian and Penny. And then on Saturday, we will be having our Asian Philosophies will be restarting its meetup after about a 5-week hiatus, and I'm not sure, but I'm excited about that. And on Saturday, we will also be continuing our Louis Sullivan series. And that will be in the afternoon with Shrikant and Rav and Sherry and I think Joya and possibly Maritza as well. I don't know if she will be dialing in from overseas. And then that's enough actually. So we'll probably see everybody before then. So
Actually, Sunday is Allison's thing on the art of Latin America.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me. Yes, I apologize. But I'm sometimes in the 52 living ideas mode, and I forgot that this is the joint. Yeah, so yes, Allison will be hosting an event on Latin American art, and that will be at 10:30 on or what does
Eastern time.
American pass? Yeah. And so I think that, yeah, it's 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. Yeah, please sign up for that. The announcement button actually disappeared.
Yeah, on mine also.
Yeah, so it's unfortunate that it didn't get announced. So anyway, I think it's going to be a great meetup.
Yeah, the videos she chose are just absolutely gorgeous. Even if you don't go, I recommend watching them. They're just really well selected.
Yeah, she put a lot of time into, I know, to researching it. You know, because she was trying to find the videos that actually worked best, you know, to communicate what she was trying to, you know, kind of focus the meetup on. So I know she spent a lot of time on this. So hopefully I'll see everybody on, well then, at least then, or earlier on Saturday, maybe. So I'll bid everybody adieu. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Good night. Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks. Thanks.